Hello, everybody, and welcome. I am Double Negative, and this is something a little different for this channel. I am joined by writer and designer Mr. Ted Peterson. Ted has credits on multiple Elder Scrolls titles, he wrote tons of lore, and today we're going to talk about it. We're also going to discuss a new game that Ted and a few others are cooking up right now. There's a lot I want to cover, so let's get to it. First though, Ted, I just want to say thank you for being here and for taking the time to do this. It's really an incredible gesture, and I truly appreciate it, so thank you very much.
No, I appreciate it too. I've seen a lot of your videos, so I'm excited to talk to you about it.
Oh, great. Yeah, that's a compliment. Thank you. To start us off, why don't you tell us a bit about your background in the Elder Scrolls? Where did your involvement in the series begin?
Well, it began actually before I got the job at Bethesda. So I went and interviewed with Julian LeFay and VJ Lachman. The interesting thing was they had never done a role-playing game before. So they had done, at Bethesda, they had done some hockey games. They had the license to Terminator. So I was actually going to be working on a Terminator game. And actually I was being hired on as a writer, not as a designer. So they had an editor for their game Terminator 2029, which was so easy to use that, they basically said, a monkey could lay down levels using this, but they needed people to basically do, you have mission briefings in between. So you could write out a script as if it were a screenplay and say, John Colon, and then you'd write in his dialogue, and it would go to him, and he'd kind of like lip flap, and then it would cut to the next character that you wrote in that. So they figured that what they really needed was a writer. So they had read my writing samples. They gave me a writing assignment, which had nothing to do with Terminators. It was for the game that they had begun discussing, which was going to be Arena. So I wrote up a short story for that assignment, and they also had me do a test where there were a bunch of, again, this is kind of like old school, role-playing concepts of like, do you know what THACO means? And, I'll fill in over here, and, talking about computer role-playing games as well. And I guess I passed it because they offered me the job, even though they liked my story, but they thought my boss in it was really goofy. So there wasn't a design yet for Arena. It was just really ideas that they had been bouncing around, and it's a role-playing games then as now are kind of a niche marketplace, and so they kind of said, well, we're going to try to do this, if we get permission. You'll work on your Terminator game, and then and on the side we'll do some designs for this kind of role-playing light action game, which was Arena, that later on became the Elder Scrolls Arena.
And so were you primarily a writer on Arena, or was there some design work involved in that as well?
Oh yeah, it was definitely design work. I mean, it was really, VJ was the producer / lead designer on Arena, and then I was everything else. So, everything else that wasn't art or programming. So, the design really evolved a lot, and it is kind of well known that, it was going to be an action game at the beginning and kind of have some light role-playing elements. And as the plan for the action aspect of it, as that part of the gameplay was not coming together, we realized that the role-playing aspects were actually more fun, and we were kind of doing these side quests to be able to get enough money to outfit your team for the main purpose of the game, which is fighting in arenas. And then those arenas evolved into major dungeons. So it was definitely a thing where, for my first outing as really a designer on the thing, I got to see what it was like to sort of have your design evolve as it's implemented.
After Arena, of course, was Daggerfall. And what was the extent of your involvement with Daggerfall? I know you were the lead designer, but in terms of writing, in terms of storytelling.
Sure. Well, VJ left at I think actually before Arena was released. So it was released and it did well enough, even though it was more of a sort of a sleeper hit, that we said, okay, we're being allowed to do a sequel. And really, from a lot of different things, from the gameplay to the story, there were a lot of things we wanted to do better. At this point, my title was no longer writer; it was lead designer on it. But writing is always, to me, a part of it. And obviously, when you're thinking about what the narrative and the story is that's, has to do, you really have to have your finger in a lot of pies. The big thing on Arena from a writer's point of view was that the storyline was incredibly cliched. It was, and more or less because it changed as the gameplay changed. So, at the end, you're going like, I'm going to kill the big bad. I'm going to put together the Staff of Chaos. So it's collect the 12 things.
And of course, when you're talking about games, the story needs to be in service of the gameplay.
Yeah.
So if it's, Arena has a relatively, well, not even a relatively, Arena has a simple story.
Yeah.
It doesn't mean it's not engaging. It doesn't mean it's not interesting, but it is simple, but it's also in service to the gameplay. And that's obviously, that's obviously your main goal.
Yeah. Oh yeah. No. And that's always, the designers that I admire and the writers I admire are the ones who, play to the medium strength, so that they recognize that, the same story that works as a book, that works as a movie, doesn't work as a game, and, vice versa across that. But really from the goal on Daggerfall was to say, because I read enough reviews where they're like, what a terrible writer came up with this story. And I was like, I'm gonna show them that I can write. So I'm gonna write something super complicated and with lots of different factions vying for power and multiple endings and lots of plate spinning. And I think I probably went overboard with that. It takes a long time to explain Daggerfall's storyline.
Oh, don't worry. We're going to get into that.
But so that was a lot, and then there was a whole lot of on the gameplay side of it. We really just Arena, the way the role playing aspect of it, you advance a character was doing in the first edition Dungeons and Dragons way, that you killed monsters in order to gain experience points in order to get from first level to second level to third level. And we changed gears on that because there were a lot of other systems out there, and we really wanted it to be a skill-based system. So in order for you to get to be a better archer, you need to work on your archery skills, and that made more sense. So then we had to kind of tilt how everything worked. At one point, we really wanted you to be able to move your character from Arena into Daggerfall, and that was sort of a late series thing where we said this translator is not going to work because the characters are so different. When we were telling the fans, make sure you buy Arena and play all the way through it because you're going to be able to move your character into Daggerfall. And then we had to say, nope, can't do that. Sorry about that.
Your work on the series continued past Daggerfall, of course. No longer as a designer, I understand it. Is that correct?
Right.
But you did make some contributions to Morrowind and to Oblivion. What was the extent of your contributions for those?
Well, I'd left Bethesda after Daggerfall, and there were a couple of years that went by when they, I know Bethesda was kind of keeping the franchise alive with Battlespire and Redguard, so they were kind of saying, boy, that Daggerfall took a lot to put together. Let's see if this franchise can survive, sort of offshoot titles. So it was a couple of years before they kind of said, okay, we are going to do an Elder Scrolls 3, a proper one. And at that point, I was living out in California. I stayed in contact with everyone, so we would meet up at the different expos and conferences and stuff. So I've always had a friendly relationship with them, and they basically said, okay, we're getting ready to do it. And so I had all sorts of, I think I probably just prompted my own inclusion by, as soon as I knew that they were doing that, saying, well, how are you going to handle the multiple endings in Daggerfall, and where's this going to be set? And so I, even though it was no longer really my baby, I had a lot of questions, and that kind of evolved into me being a consultant and writer for Morrowind, and then onto Oblivion. So there were parts where they would talk to me about our design Bible for the Elder Scrolls. I understand that they have someone now who keeps a lot of that lore in saved, and people could reference it and whatnot, but we were not great about being organized on that. So they had me kind of search my memory as to, okay, well, what is this character doing, and what is the history on this, and where should we look for this? So there was some of that. And then there was, they said, well, okay, well, we do want to have more books in the game, so we'd like you to write those. So, and by the time that were doing Morrowind, I think the Imperial Library online existed, so that they at least had all of the books there, and you could quickly find the thing that you're looking for and search through them, and at least remember what you wrote before, if not what you're going to change it to, or retcon it, or offer a different explanation.
Obviously, on Daggerfall, you wrote more than just books. You wrote the overall story and quest lines and stuff like that.
Yeah.
But for those future titles, was your writing primarily lore, or did you contribute to storylines, quest lines, dialogue, etc., or was it mostly just the books?
For the writing, I think it was 100% the books. I don't think that I didn't, for example, write any quests, but as far as kind of non-writing things, it was a part where I was consulting to discuss things like, okay, how are we going to handle this? And does this character make sense, to be doing this? Is the Empire's purpose going to be, X, Y, or Z? So, more of like brainstorming, consulting stuff. So it wasn't like creating necessarily a document that would be found in the game, but, as part of that conversation.
So next, what I want to ask you is, what to you is lore? Why does an RPG need lore? Why is it important for something like the Elder Scrolls to even have lore in addition to the quests and stories that are an actual part of the game? Why even have this stuff in there?
Well, it's a good question. I think that there's again, it goes back, what you had said earlier about the story being serving the function of the gameplay. So you do have to kind of work a little backwards to say, what is it that we want the player to be doing in this world? And if we say, for example, we want to have the player join different factions and rise through them, and the factions are going to be at odds with each other, and this faction has this goal and this faction has that goal, and you need to understand what their sort of official history is. So you decide, okay, I do want to join the Thieves Guild because they stand for this, that, and the other thing that my character would stand for. And then what the secret history is that you'd only, learn if you dive into it. There's an argument to be made that a lot of the lore is only for a niche group of the niche group who are playing the role-playing game to begin with, that there are the people who just want to jump in and start, hacking and slashing their way through a dungeon, and they don't care about what the story is or why this dungeon was created and and whatnot. But it's a part where when you are also making the decisions about, okay, we're going to have a dungeon here, we have a lot of decisions that need to be made about the architecture, what creatures might be found in it, and being able to go to the lore and say, all right, well, these are the things that give it a grounded sense, of this is the reality that it exists in. So I think lore is important, but it's not necessarily, okay, I need to know who the third Septim king was, and what his birth and death date is. That's something that needs to be, that every player needs to understand and grasp and have memorized. But when you're actually implementing the game, that's kind of the bedrock of a lot of the decisions that you make.
So would you say that for the people who are seeking out that, that kind of information, that kind of background stuff, it makes the game richer and more grounded for those people, but at the same time, for the people that really don't care about it, they can just ignore it and still have a good time? Yeah,
there are plenty of games where you need to enjoy the gameplay of it. You need to the experience of shooting an arrow across a chasm to hit an enemy on the other side and trigger whatever things that have nothing to do, or at least only a surface to do with lore, should be entertaining on their own. Basically, good lore can't save a bad game, but it can definitely make the experience richer and make it so that a player who is on their 400th hour of playing this game, because it's fun, also has something new that they're discovering, and they go like, oh, this that thing that I had maybe made assumptions about before has some backstory to it that changes my opinion on what what had happened at that stage. So I think that it's another way of giving the player rewards for getting really involved in playing it.
Have you ever had difficulty finding that balance between the story that's in the lore versus the story that's being told directly to the player? Because there are certain games where they have a ton of lore and it should be optional, but if you don't read that stuff, then the main story of the game is utterly incomprehensible, and you might be having a good time, but in terms of the story, you're just completely confused until you spend 6 hours reading an encyclopedia to figure out what's going on. Is that ever something you have to really think about balancing between, what the player needs to know and just what would be nice to know?
Yeah, no, I think that's a whole lot of the fun of doing this, to be honest. I mean, if you think of let's just say like the surface lore are, for example, quests that you go to the king. He says, there's a werewolf terrorizing the town. I need you to go out and kill it, and I'll give you 100 gold. You go out and find the werewolf, and you kill it, and you get 100 gold, and that's the end of the story. And the lore is really easy to grasp. It's a king who has a problem with this creature, and you've solved that problem. But what the deeper lore is, if books exist, or if you talk to other people and they can say, actually, the werewolf is the rightful king, and all of that stuff that makes you completely change the game experience, but you're rewarding the people who bother to look into that. It's comprehensible. If you don't dig into that, it shouldn't be a thing where the only way to deal with this king and werewolf issue is by reading a bunch of books, because again, that's fun for some players, but it's not fun for all players. But I do respect the people who want to look a little deeper into it and make sure that there is some treasure to be found if you're willing to be patient and spend a little research.
You've written a pretty wide variety in terms of lore. I reread quite a bit of it in preparation to this, and honestly, I was surprised. Some of your books are more historical in tone, kind of dry. But then there's some more biographical stuff, even some jokes that I hadn't previously run across, and they're actually not bad. They're not great, but they're not bad.
I'm not going to defend them.
I wouldn't ask you to. Some of my all around favorites are akin to little folk tales, and those are really fun. Do you tend to gravitate towards a particular style or a particular genre of writing, or is there some process to determining what flavor of lore something's going to be?
I always find it useful to when I'm writing this up, because there's a degree of, I'm writing a book from the point of view of somebody in that world. So it's not 2920 by Ted Peterson, it's by a character who presumably lived and maybe died, but wrote this book for a particular purpose, for a particular audience. And again, because I like role-playing games, that's my own role-playing. Part of the process is to say, all right, let me get into the head of the guy who's writing this. So if it's something where, I think you're talking about like in the dry history stuff, I think it's a brief history of the Empire, which was one of the first things that I wrote because I wanted to get stuff down. Where just saying like, all right, well, and then there was this war, and then these emperors did this, and this is their basic, characters and why they did things. But it does, as a book, it doesn't have a whole lot of personality because it really is a brief history. It's real, cut and dried on that. And then when you get to the part where you're able to do kind of a deep dive into, okay, well, I already established that there was someone called the Wolf Queen of Solitude who, did these things, and now let's get into that a little bit more. And at that point, as a writer, you can say, let's build up some tension. Let's do some of that narrative stuff that would make this more of a fun read than the other stuff. There needs to be a variety of different types of books out there that, things from point of view of history and literature and poetry and plays and whatever else. So you need to kind of tick a bunch of boxes, and then you just a lot of times you write to amuse yourself and hopefully have an audience that likes it too.
So you mentioned, sort of getting into the head and role playing as this writer in this universe. When it comes to writing styles, especially with the really good writers, it's usually pretty easy to spot who's who. And you can and just to use a science fiction example, you put a Ray Bradbury story next to an Isaac Asimov story,
Right.
know which one is which.
Yeah.
So when you're writing from the perspective of these fictional writers in this universe, do you ever have to sort of divorce yourself of your own preconceived notions of writing or your own style? I mean, obviously some of it is gonna leak in
Sure.
there, but is that something you have to consider?
Absolutely. I mean, there are ones that there's a series about a character named Decimus Scotti who has various adventures, and the guy who wrote it, I think his name is Wagan Jarth. He's very snarky, so he makes fun of his own protagonists a lot, and that's fun to write. But I wouldn't write it for. I wouldn't have Wagan Jarth tackle a sort of a more serious subject. And again, I think it's a combination of when you're a writer / actor that you're going like, okay, well, I'm going to deliver these lines not as myself, but as this character within this world. And there are parts where if I'm writing something that's meant to be scary, I might kind of do a little bit of a Lovecraft style on it because that's appropriate for this genre of writing. So I'm enough of a reader that I can at least tinker with different genres with probably varying degrees of success.
What influence would you say has real world literature, real world mythology and folk tales and things like that? What influence would you say has that had on your writing and your stories?
A lot. I mean, again, because I'm a reader. Julian and I are both big readers, and we kind of had our own little book club going where we would this is what I'm reading right now, and we trade books back and forth. And some of them were literature. And some of them were history that I remember we were reading a whole lot about the Borgias in Renaissance Italy and early Roman emperors. So there's a whole lot, you can kind of, we even were taking a bunch of names. I mean, there's, Tiber Septim and Tiberius, as an emperor, or, it's pretty easy to make the connection on that. And then there were certain characters that would come up of a type, Augustus's wife, Livia, who, I think there was a story that said a snake once bit her and it died. And she's an inspiration for a lot of sort of the femme fatale characters like the Wolf Queen. So sometimes it would be a character in search of a story that you would begin with saying like, I want to write a book where the main character is just utterly despicable and causes a lot of mayhem, and so I'm going to write this book. And then there's obviously, again, in service to the main story or the things that the players are doing. So some of those are fairly indulgent, where you just kind of you create it and say, well, maybe later on, because for example, the Wolf Queen is a piece of history that dates back to Daggerfall, and it wasn't until Skyrim that there are quests having to do with that character, from who was created many decades previously. So that's my favorite, is when I can kind of create something that's a deep dive into history that has really nothing to do with what the player is facing in that game, but later writers and designers can find that and say, oh, okay, I'm gonna use this and kind of expand on it and make it so it's gameplay relevant.
So obviously you've read a lot of history. You're probably familiar with a lot of mythology and things like that as well, right?
Sure.
Have you ever gone a little further than that? Have you ever, for instance, delved into like the sort of the history of history, or the history of mythology and folklore, and the psychological basis of early myths and stuff like that. Is that something you've ever studied or gotten into?
Oh, I'm very interested in that, and actually, when you even talk about the history of history, and we play around with this a lot in Daggerfall, and I know that in the later Elder Scrolls games that they would play around with it, where part of the background, for example, in Daggerfall was that there was this war between Daggerfall and Sentinel, and there are 2 books in Daggerfall called The War of Bethany, and it was purposefully these are telling 2 different stories about reality. And that was sort of our clue that just because you read it doesn't mean it's true. And that's been kind of our thing on history is to say this is some accepted beliefs. There's a lot of alternate theories. I think that there were at least two and maybe 3 versions of the biography of Warenzia, where they talk about what her and they have to agree on some basic points. So like these were her parents and she has these kids and she was the queen of here and later did something else. But the storytelling of it and the character motivations ascribed, that's always interesting to be able to kind of get into that aspect of history. And then even once we get out of the actual books, in Arena we had demons, and in Daggerfall we changed them into Daedra, and that touches obviously into books, but it also is about that myth making of saying, why would demon is such a loaded term, and if we do something it's kind of like that, and we play around with what their personalities are, so that it's not, and some of the Daedra are for sure pretty destructive and pretty transparently this guy is bad news. But there's a whole lot of kind of gray area that we wanted to play around with in the cosmology, and again in service of the gameplay, because we wanted to justify why you would want to join a different faction and believe in that faction and have that faction really define your character and believe in the truth of that faction, which might worship, Sheogorath, and all the other people think that that's literally insane. And you say, no, there's a different truth here that I understand that you don't understand, because I have this lore and stuff to kind of back me up.
Obviously, you weren't the only one, writing stuff for these books, or for these games rather. Who else was around during your time, and just how many different people were involved in the writing? How did that kind of work logistically?
Well, when we were doing Arena, as buggy as it was, and as buggy as Daggerfall was, we believe it or not actually had testers. And there were periods where they'd be waiting for something to do. And this was a community that was, we kind of got to know each other well enough that they would, throw out ideas on that. And sometimes they would basically do fan fiction. So there are several books, including some fan favorites like The Real Berenzia, that were created, that I didn't write. I mean, I edited them, and, it was a collaborative process, but there were some of these people, and we called them the Council of Wisdom, which is the name of our Discord channel for the Wayward Realms now, because kind of out of inspiration for that, there was kind of from the beginning a little bit of a crowdsource lore creation. In Daggerfall, I wrote the vast majority of the books, and I probably wrote, I don't know if I wrote the majority of the books in Morrowind, but again, a lot of the books were brought over from Daggerfall. But at that stage, by the time Morrowind came on, we had a number of other writer designers. The team had multiplied many times over, so there was there were more people who were involved in it after that stage. Morrowind, it was Ken Ralston was the lead designer, and my method was pretty much to we just did emailing back and forth, where he would say, we need to have a book series that gives the history of this location. Like, don't refer to this directly, but like this is something that you're kind of hinting at in this book. The other thing that was interesting about writing the Morrowind books, started the thing of skill books. And so in that case, the challenge was to say, all right, well, I need to do a book that gives the background of this location, offers these hints, and a whole lot of the book has to do with a person getting better at a sword. So you can imagine that there's some justification if you read this book, you would learn more about swordplay. So the skill books, adding the skill level to them was definitely, be careful what you wish for, because that was a big challenge on some of them to say, we need to have some books about, light armor is now a skill. Well, this needs to be about how to put on armor or how to make armor, or, it was hard to do. So I think some of them, again, were more successful than others in that aspect.
No, absolutely. And that's something that I didn't even think about, was the context of the skill books, and I can absolutely see that. And some of my favorites of yours are those skill books. So I can see how having that constraint, having that limitation, or just having that goal in mind could be constructive. Something like the Black Arrow was probably came out of something we need a book about archery, and that and that came out of that.
Yep.
And something like the Rear Guard might have been for sneak or something like that.
Yeah.
And no, like I said, those are some of my favorites actually. So I can definitely see the benefit of that. Many of your stories read like some of the ones I just mentioned, as I said earlier, are a lot like folk tales. And some of these are, the kinds of stories that you'd use to, terrify your children before putting them to bed. One thing that I've often wondered, and we've spoken about the context of, the writer and, being in this world, but one thing that I've often wondered is whether some of these stories really are, just fairy tales in that context of the Elder Scrolls. I mean, obviously they are fantastical stories, but
right.
This is a fantastical world that,
sure.
that they're in. So when someone in that world reads, something like the Exodus or Paula, for example, would they be more inclined to dismiss it as like a fanciful tale, or would they see some element of truth in it that we would not?
Yeah, I mean, I think that a lot of them ride that line in between. I mean, there's some things that are pretty clearly fantasy within fantasy. But I do think that, you're correct in that if it's not a world like ours, if you read a book that has a dragon come in and do some stuff, you go, okay, this is a fantasy novel. But if you're living in a world in which, there's a dragon down the street, and now I'm reading a book about a dragon, then the lines at best get pretty blurry, and which is great from a writer's point of view, that you can say this isn't necessarily written in stone, but this is this is something that later designers and writers can run with. You mentioned that we were talking about the Decimus Scotti books. There is one that takes place in Valenwood and one that takes place in Blackmarsh, which are not places that you could go to in the games that they were written for. And so I just made up stuff that sounded kind of cool to me and said, if later designers say, we're going to do a game set in Blackmarsh, and we don't want to have an underground worm transport system that moves people around from location to location, ignore that. This was fiction. But if you do want to do that, then it can still be fiction, but it's it touches on some things that players would actually know in that. I think the other thing that's a little artificial about the books, in terms of the style and maybe kind of that folktale aspect of it, is that I think you could probably find a good chunk of them that have kind of a twist ending. As a writer, I think that for me that was more of a function of, even the long series wouldn't have been a full, complete novel if it were all written out. So if you're picking up something that looks in the game looks like a book and has many pages in there, there's a little suspension of disbelief that maybe what you're reading is not necessarily the whole book, that you're kind of getting a summary of it, because again, if you pick Pala off the bookshelf in game, it looks like a thick book. But if you printed it out off your printer, each chapter is, whatever, 5 pages or something like that. So it shouldn't look like that. So there's a little suspension of disbelief. And I think that maybe that twist ending thing is a part where I was trying to, make it all feel bigger than it was, in a sense. So.
One thing I'd like to discuss for a little bit is the topic of contradictions. A pretty well-known instance is with the Sayesi. In 2920, you describe them as having tails and, being, literally being snake men.
Right.
However, there's plenty of evidence to the contrary, indicating that they're simply a race of men who are indigenous to Akavir. And I'm not going to ask you for a definitive answer on which one is true, because even if you were to give me one, that would just spoil the fun, and I don't want to do. And I don't want to do that.
Right.
What I do want to know is how this sort of contradiction comes about, because the Sayesi are a major player in the world. They've had a lot of interaction with Tamriel. Was something like this ever done intentionally in order to just sow some doubt or add some mystery to something? Or is this kind of thing simply the result of having, multiple writers?
Sure. Well, a whole lot of it, the answer is a whole lot of it is on purpose. And again, going back to Daggerfall, where we wrote 2 different books called The War of Bethany, and we're showing, from the beginning, philosophically, what you read is not necessarily true. That obviously isn't to say that, there's plenty of clear examples of retconning that go back to the second Elder Scrolls, and then the third Elder Scrolls contradicted some stuff in the second and the first, and the things like books to me are really easy to justify why there'd be contradictions in that. It's a little harder to justify contradictions in what the player actually sees and experiences as he goes through the world, and those contradictions are ones that bother me more. And to a certain degree, it's easier on the first couple of Elder Scrolls. First of all, they're the first one, so there's not that much stuff to contradict. And then as the team gets bigger, there's more stuff that can kind of slip through the cracks and go, okay, nobody caught that change in the world. I think that the classic example is there are lots of descriptions of what the Imperial Province looked like, and then when you actually play Oblivion the first time you're able to go to the Imperial Province, it doesn't go with what's been written before, and there's not really a justification of like, why would a book say it's a jungle when it's a European style forest? There's not an obvious, well, this contradiction existed because it was trying to, this faction wanted to lie to you about, this, and people would know what is in the Imperial Province when that comes out, when that book came out. So it's a obvious mistake. So there, I'm not going to say that every contradiction is done on purpose, but a good chunk of them are we're meant to give you, okay, well, what source do you want to believe? And there's justification for you to, support whichever story you like better or suits your character's purposes more. If you're going to be a worshiper of this Daedra, or a believer in this race from Akavir.
So when there is a contradiction like that, there isn't always necessarily a right or wrong answer.
I think it depends on the contradiction. I think that there's a part where we should know as writers and designers, and this is something that I'm dealing with the game I'm working on now, is we should know what the truth is. But I think it makes a boring world if this is a history, everybody knows that history, this is the cosmology, everyone agrees on the cosmology, and then you don't even have any reason to talk to NPCs because everyone has the exact same point of view.
No, that's good. And I agree with that completely. Sort of related to this topic, and we're going to get back to Daggerfall a little bit. I have a theory about dragon breaks, and this is mostly this is mostly a hunch. I haven't done my usual level of investigation on this, but you mentioned earlier that Daggerfall had multiple possible endings to the main story.
Right.
how many different endings are we talking about?
Oh, I didn't look this up before. 5 to 8.
Yeah, it's something in there. Yeah.
Maybe 9.
So when it comes to writing the lore that follows the events of Daggerfall, having all of those possible outcomes in the works to deal with is kind of a continuity nightmare. And so the so-called warp in the West is one of the few confirmed occurrences of a dragon break in the lore. There are a lot of theoretical ones that people talk about, but that's really one of the very, very few that is actually confirmed. And it seems to be the earliest one that was written about, although I'm not 100% on that. So could dragon breaks have been devised specifically in order to resolve Daggerfall's endings?
That 100%, that's the reason why it was invented.
Oh.
So that's a definitive answer, is that was a retcon, and it ended up making for an interesting cosmology and world in creating it. There's a part of it where, again, going back to the gameplay supporting the world, where I always felt, I definitely remember all the conversations about how to resolve what I had set up in Daggerfall for the people who were kind of continuing on with TES3, and how they were going to say, part of it was, well, this takes place on the other side of the Empire, so the people over there don't necessarily understand what happened, on the opposite coast. Something happened over there, and it doesn't have much to do with our story, whether Numidium conquered this land, or the King of Worms, became the God of Worms, or whatever. All of that is local stuff that we don't necessarily need to understand. The reason why we had multiple endings in Daggerfall was because that's the way I think a role-playing game should allow you. If you're a player in this world, you should have some power in affecting the outcome of things. Otherwise, you're just that cog in the wheel that moves to the left, and whatever you do, X is going to be the result. And that just being basically a character in a narrative who doesn't have as much freedom as the medium really suggests that you should be able to have. So to a certain degree, the Dragon Break is a little bit of a betrayal of that, to say, well, we've created a world in which a Dragon Break definitely happened. All of these things resolved, and this is what the situation is in the Iliac Bay at the time of Morrowind and later games. And that, to some degree, that compromise kind of makes whatever choice you made irrelevant, because a Dragon Break happened, and this was the result, and it didn't matter what choice you made at the end of Daggerfall. Regarding
Dragon Breaks is something in the lore that I really have mixed feelings about, because when you look at something like the Warp in the West, where it is a confirmed thing that this happened, and there's a reason that it's there, and it's written in a way that it makes sense that this doesn't make sense, and I don't know if that makes sense or not. But as I said earlier, there are very few actual confirmed cases of Dragon Breaks, but a lot of people like to ascribe the Dragon Break to basically any situation that doesn't make sense, and that's something that I have a hard time with, because
it's a little convenient.
Because it's a little convenient. It doesn't have to be the catch-all explanation for everything. There are multiple somewhat contradictory accounts, not entirely, but somewhat contradictory accounts of the events of the Battle of Red Mountain. And theories abound about why that is, and a lot of people say, a Dragon Break happened. It's like, well, that it seems kind of too convenient. It seems like too easy an answer, rather than actually looking at the perspectives of the different people who were there and what motivations they may have for having different perspectives. Are they spinning the truth, or did they really see something different? And to me, that's a lot more interesting than just, a Dragon Break happened, and, that's that,
yeah.
And that's the explanation. Is that a sentiment you share in that regard?
100%. I mean, I think that, again, we've established that a Dragon Break is a thing. For it to be a thing that causes you to lose curiosity in researching things more, then I think it's a bad thing. And it if there's one Dragon Break, there are probably multiple ones. So that is a possibility. But I think that there's this is my philosophy when it comes to the real world, is that that the answer being I don't know is a legitimate answer, to say, what really happened there. I don't know, and I'm interested, so I'm going to read more. That would be the ideal situation. If it's I don't know, therefore Dragon Break, then take your pick, whether it's lazy or too convenient. If the answer is a Dragon Break, that's fine, as long as there's a lot of stuff to support other theories, so that you may know what the real event that happened over here, spin a bunch of narratives that people, different unreliable writers, it spun out about that, because they have something to gain by saying these are the events at this location. That to me is a lot more interesting.
Right, and there's definitely a difference between if, say, a nation or a character in the universe is telling people, oh, it was a Dragon Break. There's a difference between that and the fans deciding that it was a Dragon Break and just jumping to that conclusion. It can be an interesting tool for sure when it comes to storytelling and when it comes to the lore, but the only thing I really dislike about Dragon Breaks is exactly what you were talking about, that it can become a sort of catch-all solution when there are other potential and other more interesting explanations to be found.
And it'd be nice if there was some evidence behind that. If there was something where, if we know whenever a Dragon Break occurs, suddenly a horde of black cats that go rampaging through the countryside, and he's like, okay, well, that's interesting. Maybe that doesn't necessarily prove it either. That can be a coincidence too, but at least it says, I've got a little bit of evidence. It's not just a contradiction that makes me say that this is what happened, but I have some evidence to support my Dragon Break, theory for this.
And in a lot of cases there is, but it's hardly conclusive.
Yeah.
In the Warp in the West, one of the most striking aspects of the Dragon Break is that the lands in between those regions is practically gone. It's been completely laid to waste by the event, and that's a smoking gun.
Yeah.
Whereas with a lot of other stuff, it's a lot more tenuous, and so that's kind of where my mixed feelings come from. My kind of love-hate relationship with the Dragon Breaks, and it's kind of why I've hesitated on talking about them, because it's a hard topic to discuss without bringing in a lot of fan theories and conjectures and stuff like that.
Well, and also this goes back to kind of the whole point on lore building, is that there's a whole lot of people who don't give a shit about like what happens behind the scenes in the world, and they're just going to play through and hack and slash and play the game this way. So the people who are arguing about lore are those people who have read the books and really dove deep into the lore, and they should be the people who are curious enough to want to analyze this from different points of view and offer a theory, recognize some issues on it, and shouldn't kind of go for the easy, well, move on to the next topic because we've established that's a Dragon Break.
No, that's a fair point. We've talked a lot, obviously, about the in-game context of lore, and we've touched on this a little bit, but I have some more specific questions regarding the reliability of sources. And so, I mean, if you'll allow me to provide a little bit of perspective for you, what I try to do on my channel is take all of these books from the Elder Scrolls, find all of the ones that relate to a certain topic, read and reread everything, and then cobble together a concise and comprehensive narrative, or at least as close as I can get.
Right.
And there are certain aspects of the lore that can make that process more difficult. The big one that we've already discussed is Contradictions. But right alongside Contradictions is that question of reliability. And we talked about, Brief History of the Empire and Biography of the Wolf Queen as, being kind of dry, sort of, history book-like, which is great because, we can get into, the history of history some more and, how history is written by the victor, but you got to draw the line somewhere. These
right.
Have kind of dry history book tones, so they can pretty much be taken at face value for the most part. But then, way, way, way on the other side of the spectrum, for example, is something like the 36 Lessons of Vivek,
right.
which, it reads like the diary of a megalomaniacal nut job. And, dealing with stuff like that is also pretty straightforward because it needs to be taken with a grain of salt, and you just know that going into it. But where I start to run into problems is with the stuff that falls somewhere in the middle, which includes a lot of what you wrote. Stuff like A Dance in Fire, by Wagan Jarth in 2920, those are set in the midst of major historical events.
Right.
2920 is the most extensive account of the CIC Potentate versus Duche's rise to power. It's historically important, but the tone there, it leans towards dramatic.
Yeah.
And so, that leads me to question its authenticity. And so my question is regarding 2920, how do you imagine that Karlovac Townway went about writing 2920? Did he study actual records? Did he conduct interviews? How much of this is a historical event with a little bit of dramatic license?
Right.
Or is it, just a dramatic fictional story within a historical setting?
I think and it's a fair point, because I think that it for sure is not 100% historically accurate. There's an author who is named on that, and so he within the realm of the world wrote it. The characters in it, they're for this world, real people in it, and real gods, and real locations, and real battles, and like all of the narrative things that are mentioned in there happened. I'd say like any conversation should for sure have more than a sprinkle of salt on there, that if it's a conversation between Almalexia and Vivek, which just the two of them, then
who was the fly on that wall?
Nobody was. So it was this Karlovac Tanwe saying, well, we know that they know each other. We know that this event happened later on. I'm going to invent this conversation that happened over there, because this at least makes sense given what event that multiple people witnessed took place. I think that there's a philosophy that you can, and I haven't dove too much into this in the Elder Scrolls, but it's definitely been a thing on writing the stuff for my new game, where you think in terms of culturally what different groups consider to be important as far as like factual truth and maybe a grayer truth, but actually touch on a bigger truth of things that happen. So I could argue that in the case of 2920, the writer it's like I'm gonna write this even though I don't know every single detail. I know enough about this stuff that I'm going to do this. And also, I think it's like you said, it's written dramatically. So I think he wanted to sell some books. So I think that he meant for it to be entertaining. The Empress causes the death of the Emperor, or she in some way sends an assassin to.
Yeah, she had her hands on it. It was very indirect, but yeah.
But I think that for me that felt in writing it that like this was a rumor that she was never tried for or whatever, but people said, yeah, that given her character, given what happened, that would sort of make sense.
So there's a little bit of conjecture involved, a little bit of dramatic license.
Yeah, gossip.
But none of it baseless. It's more, more filling in the gaps, connecting the dots than just completely making stuff up.
Yeah, and again, when you're talking about what the Akaviri are like within that world, I do think that I maybe referenced some tales, but I don't believe I described them so detailed that for sure that this is exactly what they look like, that there'd be a little bit of dramatic license on that.
No, it is very imprecise, but there are multiple instances throughout 2920 where other characters will refer to them as snakes. So, it's not like there's an anatomical breakdown or anything like that, but it is pretty clear that from, at least the perspective of the people in this story that, this is what they are. But then, like we said, there's, plenty of other lore and plenty of other sources that say otherwise.
And I'll tell you, in that specific case, that is a result of discussions with Michael Kirkbride and Ken Ralston. That I think Michael Kirkbride had written the Pocket Guide to the Empire, which came with Redguard, and I think that's the one that first mentioned these particular creatures in Akavir, and called them kind of like vampiric snake men. And in writing it, I said, because we had established that there were potentates that had sort of taken over the empire. So I said, well, what, is this literally accurate? And I feel like Kirkbride was like, yes, they are literally vampiric snake men. And Ken Rolson was like, I don't know about that. And so as a writer and a contract writer for hire, I said, well, the guy who wrote this book isn't sure himself. So he's going to say, yeah, there's a whole lot of snaky stuff going on, but I'm not going to say like it spread its hood and venomous fangs, dripped out or whatever. That I'm gonna have to do this dance myself because I don't know.
Going back a little bit to Wagan Jarth, there's I think 4 books with his name on them, and 2 of them concern the adventures of Decimus Scotti.
Right.
Those as well, they have historical settings and they have some historical significance, but they definitely seem like they're more for entertainment.
Yeah.
About how much of that would you say is truth, and how much historical basis did he use in some of those?
I think that those are probably fiction, unless in a later Elder Scrolls game you meet up with Decimus Scotti. I don't think he's not a significant enough character in the grand scheme of the world that you would do a false biography about him like you would do about Berenzia or Emperor whatever. I mean, he's this lowly clerk at this building commission in the Imperial City. So I'd say 20 was more historic, and the Wagan Jarth things are more novelty. And the writer on that, when you're talking about it, sort of inspiration. So the clue's kind of in the same Wagan Jarth. There's a British writer named Evelyn Waugh, who wrote a bunch of historic, not historic, he wrote novels, but they often tied into real life events, and they often had unsympathetic characters that were kind of involved in these misadventures, and a lot of times were really passive, and things happened to them rather than them. They weren't heroic at all, which to me, when you're figuring out all the different things you're going to write in a world, there's a lot of stuff where you're going, I need to write the story about this emperor and this queen and this guy who founded the Mages Guild, and these important historic figures. But to make the world feel more real, there's a guy who works for the building commission in the Imperial City who's in charge of some real bureaucratic stuff because roads get built and things like that. And just saying it'd be interesting to have a character, like how does a character like that survive in this world where monsters are running all over the place and you're barely surviving it as an adventurer.
So earlier I asked you about real world mythology and sort of the influence that may have had on some of your writing. And so my next set of questions have to do with that and what I believe to be specific instances of some real world myths being used as the basis of certain aspects of lore in the Elder Scrolls. My interest in myths and stories extends beyond the Elder Scrolls, of course, and I've noticed some parallels here. And whether they're intentional or not, I find these things interesting. I'd like to lay some of these things out and get your thoughts or whatever insight you may have. Does that sound good?
Yep, perfect.
Let's start at the beginning and talk about creation myths. Real quick, here's how the story goes. The universal force of order and light acts opposed to the force of chaos and darkness, thus creating the universe. Order is represented by the highest of all beings, which then creates manifestations of itself in order to represent its various aspects. Those aspects create the spiritual world, then later the physical world and its primordial inhabitants. Throughout this, the spirit of the force of chaos works to disrupt the creations of order. The spirit of chaos makes its own creations and corrupts the world, which is why death, suffering, and evil exist. In result, the people of the world are caught in a struggle between the spiritual and material worlds. What I've just described in very broad strokes is the story of creation as told by Zoroastrianism, which, for the audience's sake, is a real religion that dates back to just before ancient Persia, the modern form of which is still practiced in parts of the world today. And there's really a shocking amount of similarity between this and the common creation myth found in the Elder Scrolls, and I could probably spend way too long comparing the two side by side. Almost all you need to do is change the names of the gods. It's that close. There's some key differences, but they're so close to each other that I have to wonder whether, Zoroastrianism or something like it was the jumping off point for the cosmology of the Elder Scrolls, or if this is just the most mind-blowing coincidence of all time. Is there anything you can add to this? What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I guess maybe I should start off by saying a lot of the cosmology is stuff that was really developed during Morrowind. In Daggerfall, we had established that there were these gods, and these gods were fairly, again, orderly. That that you would have a goddess of love, you would have a god of logic and reason, and these, eventually, they became the Aedra. I don't think I really pushed law versus chaos as a major theme in the first two Elder Scrolls games. The Daedra were really the dark versions of the gods. That you would have a goddess of love in Dibella, who is this goddess of a sexual kind of love, but it was, for lack of a better term, good sex. And then you had someone like Sanguine, who was the debauchery and rape and kind of perverted love. So to some degree, I was thinking philosophically at the time less about the Daedra were chaos so much as these good ideas taken too far. And some of them are about destruction. There's a good side to destruction, in the real world as well. But that's definitely getting more into the dark side. A lot of that cosmology is Michael Kirkbride, and he wrote the 36 Lessons of Vivek. He is much more into that aspect of world building, where it's creating the big myths as opposed to historic myths. And the Zoroastrianism is, for sure, it's no coincidence. It's that was the jumping off point for a whole lot of it.
Oh yeah, it's a common theme for sure, and not just in video games. I mean, to be fair, and this this wasn't intended as a criticism in any way. I mean, but to be fair, Zoroastrianism was also the jumping off point for a lot of other real world religions and beliefs and stuff as well. So if that's where it came from, then it makes sense, seeing as it is a good jumping off point, and that's been established through our own history.
And Tolkien, who obviously is the father of a whole lot of our ideas of how to create a sword and sorcery world, in the Silmarillion, there's a whole lot of that as part of his creation myth as well. So
yeah, and that makes sense. But as far as like the whole creation, really big stuff, that was really more of a Kirkbride thing, or
yeah. And again, with a lot of kind of general brainstorming. Gotcha. and with a lot of, I really do think that Ken Rolston had an overall philosophy of like, that's fine, we'll put it in the game. I'm not saying that that's really what happened, which is pretty close to my philosophy too. That in the real world game, these people, nobody was around at that point to be able to say what really happened. So they're kind of relying on what their what their own myths are, and what their things that make sense to them within the context of their lives.
Where is the line when it comes to stuff like this? Because obviously, you take inspiration from this and that, and sometimes you intentionally pay homage to something, like you mentioned earlier, Tiber Septim, taken, from, Emperor Tiberius, stuff like that is fine. But where does that cross the line? Where does that, when does taking inspiration and paying homage cross into the territory of ripping something off? And, is that something that you need to avoid? And how would you go about that?
Well, there's a bunch of different philosophies on that. And you can see the difference. I think it all comes down to the player's experience, within all of this lore building. So if you look at Arena and Daggerfall, and then to a certain degree Oblivion and Skyrim, those were supposed to feel more like you're in some version of the real world. That this is what a castle looks like, and this is what a forest looks like. And it's, again, lack of a better word, not weird. And if you've decided you're gonna go, I guess, play it straight, then you're going to have to take a whole lot of real world stuff and put it into the game. And then, hopefully twist it enough that it's original and worth exploring, and saying, okay, well, this looks just like the real world. If you can take a little clip of walking through a forest in Skyrim and say, yep, you're just in a medieval world simulator. When you start getting into Morrowind, where a lot of this stuff was really being figured out, the player experience was much weirder. The architecture is different. You've got the idea of these demigods, or maybe even living gods, who are around among us, and you go, okay, well, how does that work? What's the difference between a living god and just a really powerful NPC? I guess we don't have any parts in the world where we try to explain natural forces that are the same as in our world. You just kind of will assume, okay, well, these basic forces work just the same as in this world, because we don't have any reason to reinvent them. But if we're going to reinvent something that's different from our world, then borrow a little bit of this, twist it a little bit, change the name. And again, there's usually not one sort of author behind the myth, that it is a result of many different conversations and people pointing out, oh, well, if we do that, that means this. And going like, okay, well, we can't do that exactly. And, massaging things a little bit to make it fit within that world's experience. So once you kind of say, we live in a world that has a different type of environment, and you come up with an explanation for it, that can also inform back to the player's experiences. So, it becomes kind of this wheel of okay, now that we've established that that this is how the universe was created, to justify other things we've done, what does that mean in terms of other decisions that we want to make later on? So yeah, I know that doesn't really say about when you're deciding whether you're going to rip something off. I mean, we've ripped off things in the Elder Scrolls that we didn't mean to rip off, for sure. And that was a result of, you have things that are in your mind that you say, this sounds cool, and you don't remember where you heard that the first time. And we have names that who was it? Somebody wrote a series of books where it takes place in Morrowind, and that was done at about the time that we were creating all the place names, and we put it in there. And it is not a purpose ripoff, but it was something where somebody had read these books and thought the name sounded cool, didn't remember where they thought they had invented it out of their head, and they hadn't. So we're human, so we're playing God literally by creating this world and by creating the gods that created this world. But we also are prone towards laziness, forgetfulness, our own contradictions of what we believe in. I mean, it's also interesting that we even have, I know, and I probably won't name names, but I know that different people who've worked on the project had different political and religious leanings than other ones. So there will be a part where even unconsciously you'll put stuff in there which go along with your belief system, which may or may not be something that another world creator is going to buy into as something that makes logical sense to them.
Talking about personal beliefs and perspectives on, the gods and stuff like that, there is quite a lot of that in the Elder Scrolls. In the world of Tamriel, there's a definite schism between the elven races and humanity when it comes to spirituality. It's pretty pronounced.
Yeah.
The way I see it is that what it comes down to is there's a critical difference in their respective regarding the origins of their species and really about their relationships with their respective gods. For the Altmer, the gods are literally their ancestors. There's a direct connection. They are descended from the gods. Whereas for the Nords, for example, the gods are seen as entirely distinct, separate, superior beings who created the world and created humanity. Is this something you can comment on at all?
Well, again, not to repeat what I've said before, but it comes down to the player's experiences, and you should know when you're dealing with an Altmer king that this is where he's coming from, and when you're dealing with a Nord king, he's coming from someplace different, and they're going to be at odds with each other, and they're going to have different attitudes towards, like you said, these are our ancestors. How can you not feel pretty good about yourself if you're direct descendant of these gods? You still end up with the same worshipful belief in something more powerful than you are, but where that, what that relationship is obviously very different. And again, that you can, go back to myth making in the real world, that there are cultures that are, we're ancestor worshipers. And it doesn't even have to be like the mighty god, just saying like great grandfather's spirit is protecting this home because and his family, and maybe the further removed it is, many generations back, it's more of the whole tribe or the whole nation or the whole race, and that is a real world thing that you just kind of extrapolate on for to inform that whole culture.
Like I said, this is something that I, just find very interesting, and it's especially interesting to see something like this adapted for something like the Elder Scrolls, because we have things like this in our world where, very generally speaking, most Western religions say that the universe and, humankind are, creations of God or of the gods, whereas in a lot of Eastern philosophies and religions, the universe is the result of a splitting off.
Right.
From a higher God, and so therefore God is all around us and within us. So it's like you said, it's still the belief in a higher superior power, but it's not so much what you believe in, but where you're looking for it. It's something that I find incredibly interesting, how that can result in such a difference in personal philosophy and in spiritual philosophy. When it seems like such a subtle distinction, but it results in some pretty dramatic differences when it comes to philosophy. And and like I said, whether it's intentional or not, seeing something like that in the Elder Scrolls, it gives it a feeling of authenticity to see that kind of spiritual conflict.
Yeah.
And what I like about it is that, just like our world, there is no one way of looking at it. This guy over here might think there's one way of looking at it, but this guy over here is gonna disagree with it and say, no, this is the case. And it's nice to see something like that. Some alternatives in interpretation actually being implemented in a setting like this.
Yeah, no, thank you, and it certainly was purposeful to, it does go back to the unreliable narrator and contradictions and all of that as being, part of the philosophy on kind of throughout the lore of the series.
So the next thing I wanted to call out relates to Queen Alessia's relationship with Akatosh. In the story, Akatosh grants Alessia his blessing and his power via the Amulet of Kings, which symbolizes an almighty covenant that gives Alessia and her descendants the ultimate right to rule the empire. Can you kind of see where I'm going as far as similarities go?
Yeah.
Yeah. It's a simplistic example, but it's almost word for word the story of Arthur receiving the sword Excalibur.
Well, and it's also the divine right of kings is a classic medieval concept of the person who's on the throne is a representative of God. And the reason why you don't commit treason against the king or queen is not just because that'll throw things into chaos and cause civil unrest. And it's not a governor who was elected to this position, or someone who rose to that level of power because they were very smart and really hardworking, and all the things that we like to think that a person will gain power because of these things. That it's because they're the chosen one, or part of the chosen one. So, yeah, I mean, I think that those are all part of the consideration on that. And it also is convenient for me explaining why the player can't become the king.
obviously this is a pretty simple comparison, but if we boil it down just a little bit more, we can talk about how this story and really many others in the Elder Scrolls, including those of pretty much all of the player characters, kind of fit into this classic sort of archetypal structure of the hero's journey. You've spoken out previously, and you just mentioned it. You've spoken out against the chosen one trope in RPGs, and for good reason. I completely agree with your sentiments there. It's cliche, it's overused, and it's not interesting. Does that pretty well sum up your feelings on that? Yeah, I mean,
that makes it a little more black and white. I mean, there are chosen one narratives that I really like. And usually it's got a twist on it, but it does seem like it's a lazy way to make the universe revolve around you and your actions. To just say, well, no one else could have done this thing because you were born on a certain day, and therefore the whole universe is going to revolve around you. I always think it's more interesting if it is a little bit more of a meritocracy, that you were able to do certain things because you've been working really hard at it. Morrowind flirted with the chosen one, archetype of saying, are you the reincarnation of Nerevar? And there are some evidence that you weren't. And those are purposefully put in there, again, to say, what if a player doesn't want to be the chosen one? And they really were, they really were just at the right time in the right place. And they did this thing of fulfilling this prophecy, but really anyone who tried hard would be able to, accomplish that.
One thing that, looking back at Morrowind, one thing that I do find, really special about that story is that yeah, it is set up as kind of a chosen one story, but as you progress, it does become clear that not only, do you have the option of, not trying to fulfill this prophecy, but it's also established later on that even if you do attempt to be the chosen one and fulfill this prophecy, there's always the chance of failure.
Yeah.
And there's that one scene where you speak with all of the past, failed Nerevarines, and that was and that's something that looking back on it, I've always thought was really special, that you could be the chosen one, but there's absolutely no guarantee, and that's something that I've always really appreciated in that story.
As opposed to the Dragonborn, which really kind of leans into that chosen one narrative.
Yeah, this is just my opinion, but that does go a little far into that, sort of stereotype of, you're the only one that can kill the big bad and save the day. So yeah, it's a subjective call as to and to a certain degree, I appreciate the fact that the Elder Scrolls games have different, sort of philosophies for not every character is necessarily the destiny's taught that will is put on this earth in order to fulfill this prophecy, and only they can do it. And so there's little variety in who you are and where you're coming from, and what your role in this world is. The last thing I want to very briefly mention, as far as comparisons go, because it's kind of the elephant in the room, is the very, very extensive parallels between the Nords in the Elder Scrolls and, of course, Old Norse culture and mythology in our world.
Yeah,
it's very, very apparent. Honestly, though, I'm just mentioning it because it is that elephant in the room. The comparison's so obvious that it's probably not really worth going into super precise detail.
Yeah.
It's in the name Nord, it's pretty straightforward.
Sure.
We could go on and on about every single thing in the Elder Scrolls, finding a whole bunch of different connections to the real world. The connections are really almost endless. It might even be an idea for a series. But to round off this little section, Ted, I just want to ask if you're aware of or can come up with any other kind of comparisons like this that you think are interesting or are worth discussing. Anything specific coming to mind?
Yeah, I mean, I think obviously the Nords, and from like you said, from their very name, when we were creating those initial races that you could play, we were creating a Dungeons and Dragons campaign, and when you are imagining, okay, I want to play a drow in Dungeons and Dragons, you go like, okay, well, it's a dark elf. We're going to change the name. We're going to keep some of those comparisons and reject other ones. I think one thing that I've come to not like about what we did in those early games, and I'll just put it up to youth in when kind of creating them, is I don't love the racial bonuses and minuses that you're given if you're human. And if there are Red Guards and Nords and Bretons and Imperials, and that just by being, theoretically born into that tribe of man, that
born within these borders that are drawn on a map.
Right. Yeah, exactly. That you're going to get a plus 10 to your intelligence and a minus 10 to your strength, or whatever. It bothers me because it's racist. I mean, I think that there's a part where you can say all of these have different cultures, they have different architecture, they have different histories, they have different philosophies, and all of those things are interesting and worth exploring. But I don't love, well, frankly, I want to play a dark-skinned character, and he's going to have a lower intelligence and a higher strength than if I decide to play a light-skinned character.
In a way, it encourages specialization, but at the same time, it's sort of limiting. Like, what if I want to be an orc that specializes in mysticism? Why should that be a problem? Why should I be penalized for that?
I mean, but okay, well, here, so taking that, what's interesting then is if you say, okay, you want to be an orc that specializes in mysticism, you don't have a racial minus to being having that skill. You might have some cultural pushback that you could enter into a world where orcs culturally hate mysticism, that they think that it was an invention of the elves, and they've got some cosmological rationale of how this is bad for the culture or whatever. So you might get some pushback from your own people about you being an orc mystic. That is a much more interesting game to play to me than, well, I chose to be an orc. It's going to be harder for me to be a mystic because I get these racial minuses because orcs are inherently inferior to this than this other race is to that. So it's not just about, whatever you want to call it, politically correct or racist or whatever view of this. It just is not, it doesn't make for as good of a game if it's the reason why more orcs are warriors is because they've got these bonuses and these minuses. If it can be more of their culture, then I think that you've entered into a more dynamic world.
No, I agree. And I never even thought to think of it that way, but I think you're absolutely right. So moving on, when it comes to very specific stuff in the lore of the Elder Scrolls, I really don't have a whole lot that I'd like to ask you about that I can't figure out, myself by reading the books.
Which I encourage everyone to do.
Yeah. And that's something that I like to do. So I don't just want to, consult your encyclopedic knowledge or anything like that on everything. But there is one subject that I'd like to spend a little bit of time on, and that's the Psijic Order.
Uh-huh. Congratulations on the pronunciation.
Oh, thank you. You've written more about the Psijics than anyone else has, unless I'm mistaken. There are 3 books which have your name tied to it. Fragment on Artaeum, Mysticism, The Unfathomable Journey, and The Old Ways, which deal with the subject of the Psijic Order pretty much entirely.
Right.
And then you touch on them a little bit in Feyfolken, and there's some really good nuggets scattered throughout 2920 as well. First of all, just to start out with, could you explain to the audience who or what is the Psijic Order?
Sure. Well, I mean, I think that they might have originally been invented when we were coming up with the story for the Mages Guild. Gameplay-wise, we had already established there are Mages Guilds throughout Tamriel, and you as a player could visit them. And so when we were kind of creating what the history was of it, saying, okay, well, there was a time when that wasn't the case, and that there are people whose philosophy was much more, there's this powerful force called magic. We need to hold on to this because we don't want to, put this out to the world at large. So they needed to have a different philosophy to explain why they weren't as democratic as the Mages Guild, and their explanation was justifiable. That they, had a different idea of what their role in the world was, what their obligations were, and the other thing that kind of fell into it was mysticism. So all the other schools, we could kind of create a philosophy around them, to say like what you are manipulating in the world is, X, Y, and Z in order to create a fireball or to cure paralysis or whatever. And then we had a whole bunch of spells that we had in the game, probably from Arena, and new spells that we wanted to put into Daggerfall. And they were just this kind of grab bag of spell effects that didn't really have a philosophy to them. And I've always thought that the tricky part on Magic in terms of the game, and this may fall into cosmology in kind of a broader scope, is that you don't want it to be so explained that it becomes mundane, that it just, it is the way we think of, electricity. So mysticism was kind of that, practical gameplay purposes, it's the grab bag of spell effects that we couldn't neatly put into one of the other categories. But it also helped in keeping some mystery to how magic really works and what they're drawing on.
So the Psijic Order is the oldest organization of mages on Tamriel. They're also the foremost practitioners of mysticism, and that's how they're able to make the island of Artaeum move around or disappear completely. They can teleport, and they seem to be able to alter the passage of time in some way. Mysticism looks to be the oldest use of magicka in the mortal plane, aside from the gods themselves, and it's completely unlike anything else. So what is mysticism in relation to the other schools of magicka?
Well, I don't really want to, again, give like a definitive answer because I'm not employed by Bethesda and they might have a different philosophy on that. I can say what the inspiration was on it and what I think that there's evidence to suggest. Part of the thing was, and you touched on this when you talked about kind of the difference between the elves and the humans as far as their philosophy of where the gods came from. You can see in the name of the Psijic that they were originally inspired by psionics in Dungeons and Dragons as being an alternate way of having some magical effects that aren't either clerics or magic users, and going like, we're going into something that's more ESP, and you're not touching on God power, you're not touching on these forces of the universe, you're really kind of going into your own mind and having these effects because your brain is the thing that's capable of all of this power. And philosophically, the fact that they were off of the land of the Altmer meant that tied in well with their philosophy that, the gods are our ancestors. So we really have tons of untapped potential. The old ways had to do with that ancestor worship and its kind of relationship to mysticism.
In some of those books that I mentioned earlier, the Psijic Order refers to a, quote, spiritual world invisible to the unenlightened and so-called spiritual forces as being central to their doctrine.
Right.
So is this spirit world, as they call it, the source of their power? And what is the spirit world that they're talking about?
Philosophically at the time, it was, again, if you're thinking of psionics in Dungeons and Dragons, that the spiritual aspect is less about gods or things like that, and more about the spirit in the sense of the spirit within you. So it could be your brain, it could be your soul or whatnot. There is an aspect of it being, there's a lot of in psionics that have to do with extraplanar travel and coming outside of your physical form and going into these other dimensions and whatnot. So that at least was the idea of what that was supposed to sort of explore.
I do have one last question about the Psijic Order, and this one is a bit of a stretch, but I think it does have some merit, and I just wanted to kind of get your reactions to this. Or I'll try to phrase this in such a way that, plausible deniability and all that. Could the Psijic Order know what happened to the Dwemer? I'm not saying that they caused it or anything like that, but the Psijic's use of mysticism seems incredibly similar to the nature of the Dwemer's disappearance. And there is one entry in Ancient Tales of the Dwemer which suggests the Dwemer having a magical ability in common with the Psijics, which could imply that the Dwemer were also using mysticism in some way. So what are your thoughts on this?
The disappearance, I think originally we called it the disappearance of the dwarves. So that's something that I think was established as early as Arena, that we had like dwarven mines that were one of the dungeons that you could, dwarven castles that were one of the dungeons you could explore. So we just kind of said, ever since the mysterious disappearance of the dwarves. So that myth, or that mystery was established early on. It kept on being fed into it. I know that, and I feel like it's probably Kirk Bright. It might be somebody else who wrote quite a bit about it and kind of introduced, and I think it's meant to be unpronounceable, but the PSJJJJ, which ties in with the Dwemer. And it's not a coincidence that it is similar to what the people in Artaeum call themselves. So, yeah, I think that the overlap is purposeful, and the fact that they again mysteriously disappear and reappear. I guess what I'd say is that was not the plan from the beginning, but I think it's those are threads that that have been kind of tied together since their initial creation.
I think it's time we changed gears now, but first I need to give a quick disclaimer. Throughout the course of this video, I'll be using a lot of different images, and only some of them are directly related to the game Ted is developing. These are in the forms of official concept art and will be specifically noted as such when they appear. Everything else which does not have such a designation is being used for illustrative purposes only. None of these images are affiliated with Ted's game or his company unless stated otherwise. Thank you. So tell us a little about this current project of yours. What is the Wayward Realms?
It began from an interview that Julian did on Indigo's YouTube channel. I saw it and it was long and I made fun of it, but I thought it was interesting because he had talked about sort of the lessons learned in making Daggerfall and what he would do differently the next time. And his overall thing was he thought the philosophy behind what we were doing in Daggerfall was pretty solid and would have been interesting to explore further in future Elder Scrolls games. Because he stuck around longer than I did at Bethesda, and he had done some consulting on Morrowind as well, but he had moved on since then. And again, we totally respect what Bethesda did after our time, and the success of the series speaks that they were doing a lot of things that a lot of people liked. But again, I think there's a part where we go, when you look at how your kid is growing up and you go like, yeah, there are a couple of things that I wish we had stuck with. And so I had a similar thing. And of course, he's talking about it from the programming point of view, and then I was approaching it from the point of view as kind of designer and writer, and saying that, yeah, there's a lot of similar philosophy that I think would be interesting to explore with 30 years more experience, changes in technology. A lot of the stuff that we began on there having to do with these factional interactions, of having the players role in the world, really kind of evolve the world, but not in sort of the player is the chosen one type of way. The real elevator pitch version of what we're doing with the Wayward Realms is we're calling it kind of the spiritual successor to Daggerfall. So it's not an Elder Scrolls game at all, but when we put together kind of our pillars of our design philosophy and what we're going for, we began by saying what are the things that we were doing in those early Elder Scrolls games that we would like to carry on. Can we move these things into not early 90s, but modern day type of role-playing games? So that's kind of how it began. We began having conversations. We opened a Discord channel and have had a bunch of people who are joining on, and we call the Discord channel the Council of Wisdom, because that's how we got a whole bunch of lore and inspiration on those first Elder Scrolls games. So that's kind of where we're at right now. So we're in pre-production on it. So we've got we're doing a lot of technical tests, a lot of concept art, a lot of world building, and because we don't have any money yet, we're not into production. But one of the things that we really find it to be a luxury is when you're creating a world, having that time to put into pre-production, and really we can kind of take our time, that we don't have somebody under the gun saying you need to release the game at this point, and kind of test the waters with the council, our Council of Wisdom, to say, let's talk about the things, so we do have people, for example, who are passionate about cosmology and how the skies change and what that actually means, and we can get our programmers and artists and people figuring out documents, putting together tests, and not feel, well, okay, we just have to put up a skybox because we don't have time to spend on this aspect of the world. So, I mean, do I want a publisher? Yes. Do we want to? Are we ready to go into production tomorrow? No, we've got some more pre-production to do. But would we like to do it sooner than later? Absolutely.
You've been both a writer and a designer on games in the past, to varying degrees on the games that you worked on. So are you still wearing multiple hats here? What is your role specifically?
So I don't know what my title is. I think it's creative director, but lead designer, lead writer, creative director. Like I said, I got hired on by Bethesda as a writer in the beginning, and I always tend to think in terms of narrative, but I don't. As we've talked about before, narrative at the service of gameplay. So there's a part where I can't just be writer or lore creator or whatever without getting into, all right, well, if this is how magic functions in our world, what are the practical applications for the player?
I know that other than yourself, there's some pretty notable and some really very talented people working on this. You already mentioned Julian LeFay. But could you tell us a bit about OnceLost Games? Who else is involved in this project that you can tell us about right now?
One of the ones that I'm really excited about is that we actually have the original composer from Arena and Daggerfall, who's been doing some music for us, and of course, he's coming at it with the same philosophy that we have from code and design and writing point of view. That at the time that he did it in the early 90s, they were MIDI. There was MIDI music that he was creating for it. So now he has a little more tools. It is it's evolved quite a bit since then. So just having him be involved, Don Nalazetti, who was the art director on Daggerfall, has been consulting with us. His big contribution on that, in addition to being a really good artist, is that he was sort of the pipeline coordinator for all the art assets in Daggerfall. So if you just think of, we had to populate a world twice the size of Great Britain and create all of these, create the art to fill that. So he needed to be the one to manage every single asset that came through and make sure that it didn't crash the game. So it's a huge amount. It's just a huge managerial role. Nobody really wants to take that on, but he's definitely got the mind for it. And then a lot of the people we do have some coders. We have people doing fabulous concept art who are fans of the series, and that's been a large thing that we've been working on lately. Is a lot of the concept art for that. We know that we're going to be doing it in Unreal, so we've been doing a lot of tests in that, and then we've got some writers and sages and people like that. So we are generating books and background lore and all of that as we're going along.
So let's get more into your goals of this project. The stated goal is to, quote, revivify the RPG genre by applying modern development standards and quality of life advancements to the design philosophy of classic role-playing games. Do you think you could elaborate on that just a little bit?
Absolutely. I mean, I think that there's a part where what I would really consider to be the strength of the medium of games that other medium like books and movies and stuff like that don't have, and that's the interactivity aspect of it. What we're really doing is kind of going back to what that initial philosophy was of saying, at the time we didn't make those games be competitive with TV because we couldn't, that we didn't have the technology to say, okay, well, you're running through this world and it's going to look just like a big budget movie. Nowadays you can, but I think it's at the expense of some of the strengths of the medium in terms of having a world that evolves with you. So for example, we have a concept that we call the virtual game master. And one of the things that happens in that is that the world and the story evolves with your actions, just like you're doing a pen and paper role-playing game, where if you've ever DM'd or GM'd a pen and paper role-playing game, then you'll plan out this whole adventure. You'll get the module and say, okay, we're adventuring off on this, and then the players will say, actually, we're going to go to the tavern, and that there was a suspicious-looking guy that I'm going to start following. And you're going, oh, okay, well that,
or someone decides to derail it and try to rob the shopkeeper and get imprisoned, and then you got to kind of work with that.
Absolutely, and there's no reason why a game shouldn't be able to accept that challenge and run with it. So we're widening things a bit and giving you more freedom, and we are going to be going back to the Daggerfall style of giant sandbox, because I think that if you're going to be given freedom, then you don't want to be in a small room. you need to get around a little bit. So
you have touched on this a little bit, but what kinds of examples can you share of the kinds of classic design elements that you're trying to bring back?
Well, and again, I mentioned the kind of the dynamic world creation, and that being a big part of how we were able to do Daggerfall back in the day, and recognizing what the criticism of that type of world creation is that there's a flatness and there's a cookie cutterness, and there's a part where after you'd visited a certain number of towns, you could recognize patterns and saying, okay, well, this is the same city block rotated or put in a different order. And so we'd say these are the ways it worked, these are the ways that it didn't. And the good thing is we've done it before. So we're building on the shoulders of that same technology. And it goes also with quests and factional interactions. When I start talking to, specifically the designers about what we're trying to do, they'll say, oh, and your reputation with this faction should go up and down. And if the other person, this other faction hates you more because you did something for this knightly order. And I say, yeah, we did that in Daggerfall, but we didn't implement it as well as we could, and B, we also didn't always let the player know what was happening. So you could go in Daggerfall, you might go into a town and people would hate you and not want to sell you anything, or up the prices of what they wanted to sell you, or call the guards out on you, or do all these things, and the player a lot of time wouldn't know why this was going on. So it was like having a DM that had ideas in the back of his head but wasn't communicating them to the players. So that's a big part of the thing, where we think we can do a lot of the stuff we did those many years ago and learn from our lessons to make it the experience that we think it always should have been.
Now, what about vice versa? Are there any sorts of modern gaming and modern RPG elements that you think could be translated to fit into this classic, design philosophy that you're going for? Take, for example, something like a quest marker. Like, is that something that you would ever, consider trying to adapt into this philosophy of yours? Because in a way, it does kind of fly in the face of some of that classic role-playing stuff.
Yeah, no, it's a part where you want it to be a little hardcore, but not so hardcore. And what's funny is at the time that we did the first Elder Scrolls games, in some ways we were already doing some of that quality of life stuff, even way back when. That at the time we did it, there were a lot of games that you didn't have we had auto mapping systems in Arena and Daggerfall, and at the time in games like Wizardry, you had to take out a piece of graph paper, and as you're going through the dungeon, like trace it on a thing, and people were going like, this is nuts. You're making it too easy on the player by automatically filling out a map, and as you're playing the game, which again in retrospect you go, that's crazy. Like that's crazy that would be considered fun, that you're going to be doing this on your own. So we already philosophically can go with, we don't want to make this harder. But of course, when you're talking about even modern philosophy of games, there's some hardcore games, and there are people who love to put in those type of aspects of eating should be a thing within the world, and there's kind of the survival games where your character can get cold or hungry or whatever. But that was even the thing back in Daggerfall, that we had a difficulty, some options where you could turn on and off different difficulties, because it goes back to the dungeon master. If you're my dungeon master and you can tell that there's some aspect of this adventure that I'm really just hating, that you can make the thing of going like, I want you to have fun, so I'm going to adjust the gameplay, I'm going to adjust the environment to make sure that you're being challenged but also having fun.
You say that players will get to experience a realistically scaled open world. Could you put that into some context? What is a realistic scale? What does that really mean?
When we did like the pillars of what defined, what would be a spiritual successor to Daggerfall, size is a big part of it. So I think that there's a feeling, even when if people play the later Elder Scrolls games and haven't played the ones that come before then, you go like, wow, this is really huge. But if you played the ones that come before then, you go like, I feel like I'm in a shrinking room that's beautiful. And sometimes you have great vistas that you go like, okay, well, here's a big sprawling valley out below me. But if you're seeing a map of Tamriel and you're going like, okay, well, this is the area that Skyrim occupies, you go, well, it's actually this. And it doesn't have that sense of kind of world events, that because you want to be able to get around the sandbox world more. So the realistically scaled part of it is the goal to do that type of really big game where every region has its own history and culture, and you know that you're in a different region. Also, it's the different environments, different type of climate, and you do feel like you're traveling long distances, and you feel it.
So Daggerfall accomplished this, by making use of some procedural systems, and I understand you're going to be making use of some of those, same type of procedural systems here as well. Is that something you want to expand on a little bit?
Well, the only thing I'd really use to expand on is that we're not going into this having not had that experience. So we are aware of the kind of the strengths and the problems that we faced on it, and even the problems that, there's a part where when you're making these games and you're working on one of these games for long hours and over a couple of years, then you're not necessarily seeing the flaws that are in there, or there are different flaws that bother you more than they bother the average player. So to a certain degree, I feel like we kind of released the beta with Daggerfall, and now we can use the results of what how that was received and what we know were the issues in order to fix it. So we can make the environment and the locations within that environment interact better. In Daggerfall, you couldn't have like a hilly town because everything needed to be on a flat surface. So even if it's a similar building, if it's in a different location, then it's going to have a completely different feel. The buildings themselves can be procedurally generated, so they aren't there's going to be similar stone and things like that. Yes, it's you're in that region and you'll experience that, but the buildings don't have to be cookie cutter anymore, and that's the interiors as well as the exteriors. But we're still going to be, in Daggerfall, we still had some hand-created things, so we'll be continuing with that as well.
A lot of people are concerned when it comes to procedural generation, because obviously Daggerfall wasn't the only game that made use of systems like that, and yeah. I think the source of a lot of this concern is that in some of those previous games that have utilized procedural systems, Skyrim's Radiant Story, for instance, the seams can show quite a bit.
Yeah. There
are times, in that example, when it's perfectly obvious what's a procedural quest and what's not. And what ends up happening is that the system that was designed to add variety and make the experience more unique and more memorable, it ends up feeling generic instead, and it accomplishes the opposite.
Yeah.
Personally speaking, I avoid those quests in Skyrim because there's just nothing worthwhile about them. And is this a concern of yours? And how do you intend to mitigate that?
Sure. What you're touching on, which is interesting, is when Julian did the video where he said, like, I think I can fix a lot of things with procedural generation, he was thinking of world, landscape, and city generation and all of that, of fixing the algorithms and making those so that they, the world makes more sense and is more varied on that. When I think about it, I think about the quest lines, what we're calling the VGM, the virtual game master, and having things that change based on your gameplay. I think that one of the things that it's not necessarily just about variety, why we would have these procedurally generated quest lines, let's say specifically. It's about evolving with the player's choices. Well, I gave the Werewolf example like that as being a super simplistic type of quest, but why don't we stick with that just for the purpose of this? You're given a quest by a king to kill the werewolf that's terrorizing the city, and you are the type of player who's going to do a little bit more research than that. You're not just gonna like go ahead and hack and slash the werewolf because you are naturally suspicious, or you're just somebody who thinks that there's something else that's going on. Then if you were playing this in a pen and paper role-playing game, that all of a sudden I would need to say, okay, well, I want to reward this player's curiosity, so I'm going to create this whole other quest line having to do with the king's secret heir who was turned into a werewolf, and the king is trying to change things. And that quest, which was before just done by a designer, it's a super simple quest giver A tells you to kill beast B and you'll get C reward, will branch off and create a new quest based on rewarding the player for their actions and their type of gameplay. No designer could create these ridiculous spiderwebby branches off of all of these different possibilities, and the only way that it works is by these algorithms and by creating this kind of AI virtual game master who will evolve things according to how you play. The Radiant AI and the change, things in Skyrim that you mentioned, that's not that dissimilar from what we were doing in Daggerfall, where we were saying, let's create this cookie cutter quest thing where go to X, kill Y, and you'll get Z, and all those things are created by the code. So it's a pretty different beast to have something where it's not so much that quest fills in the blanks to give it more variety, but it actually changes according to what it is that the player is obviously trying to accomplish.
Right. So you're not just using procedural systems here to fill in the gaps or anything like that.
Right.
This is something that's being taken into account from a design standpoint. This is what the game is, and it's an incredibly interesting idea, because you were doing things like that in Daggerfall, and there have been other uses of procedural systems in the past, but not quite to the extent that you're describing. So it's something that I'm definitely looking forward to seeing how it pans out.
Me too.
So the Wayward Realms is an open world grand RPG. So so naturally exploration is a key aspect. Am I right about that?
Definitely.
How do you see that playing out in this massive Daggerfall sized world?
A good thing about the fact that we've had a lot of time for pre-production, that we've had a lot of time for world building. So we have created our maps and created a whole bunch of different factions that everybody has their own thing that they're trying to accomplish in this world. We've got a whole bunch of history that is behind the factions and will obviously play into the events that take place during the world. And there are multiple kingdoms, and they have different conflicts, and they will evolve. So the world is not static. Things happen that you didn't cause, and things happen behind the scenes that have a ripple effect throughout the world. That everybody's experience is going to be a little bit different in playing the game, or massively different, based not only on your actions but on how all of these mechanics make the world change in the course of playing it. So we can talk about it because we share a history, but your gameplay experience is going to be quite different than mine. And also, I mean, the fact that I'm playing a mage and you're playing a thief or whatever, you're getting into the underworld culture and learning a lot about this stuff. So, like I said, like a lot. I know I'm all over the place, but that's that's the world.
So in terms of, and we're going to talk about the world itself in a bit, but in terms of the actual travel of the world, it's an archipelago. It's a series of islands. So does that kind of play into the how you see exploration working out? Is there going to be some form of seafaring involved? Is that something that's being worked on?
Absolutely. And it plays into, again, kind of the factional stuff, that we have particular groups that are more involved in that. And again, I don't want to get too deep into what we're actually planning for this, but you can imagine at the very least there are the tradesmen, there are the pirates, there are various patrols, and there are locations that are well guarded for against sea type invasions. So that influences, as soon as you put kind of one part of the the world down, then that radiates into all the other things that need to be figured out in order to support that. So when you're procedurally creating a village and it's going to be on a river, then that means different things for what needs to be part of that village, what kind of support it needs to have, what their likely trade is going to be. So there's a part where it needs to have its consistent logic, which is something that we both have to design out and then let the algorithms kind of figure it out from based on those laws that we create.
I realize you might not be ready to talk about specifics because it's in development, so nothing's really set in stone at this point.
Right.
But in broad terms, when it comes to classes, are we going to be seeing the usual combat, magic, and stealth roles that are pretty typical for the genre, or might there be something a little different in there?
Well, I'll say that one of the things that has been really inspirational since Daggerfall came out was the Daggerfall Unity project, where they put it into Unity so that people could, literally play it. And then they made some adjustments on things that didn't work out so well. So philosophically, we always wanted it to be this, skill-based system where you could create, you're only limited to your imagination as far as what type of character that you want to play. But people, there's a guy who has a YouTube channel who he took all the language skills in Daggerfall, and the language skills were something that we didn't implement very well in Daggerfall, if at all, but they existed. And since our time, someone had added a thing where the language skills, so for you could get speak Harpy, and now when you ran into a Harpy, they might befriend you and fight alongside you. This guy sucks at magic and at fighting, but he's really good at languages, and he almost becomes the Beastmaster, where he has this whole flock of creatures that are following behind him and going that's awesome. And giving that freedom to allow people to play with this toy in ways that you didn't imagine that they would be doing, that is for sure a design philosophy of this. Is kind of the weirder the better. Those classic class systems are going to be in there for the people who want to play that way. But I think, like I said, even in exploring lore, that I really want to reward people who are curious and creative and think outside the box.
What sorts of ideas are being considered for combat?
I might need to be a little bit vague on that. I think that the only thing that I would say is a for sure thing is that it's a first person's perspective game, because I've always found that to be the most immersive way to play a game. That's a great place to look at kind of modern design philosophies, where to be able to say, we pretty much just had to play an animation if you swung a sword, and we let you, okay, well, I can play around with the mouse and swing it in different ways, and that might have some influence on the amount of damage, but you didn't really have so much of recoil and blocking and some of those things that other later games introduced into the combat mechanics. I think that the combat in Daggerfall was pretty rudimentary, so we're not really trying to continue that philosophy.
Is there anything at all you can talk about in regards to ranged combat? Whether it's magic or projectile weapons, what have you, what do you think you can do to make ranged combat more engaging and more in depth versus just pointing and clicking essentially?
Well, I don't want to get too much into magic. We're really doing something different with it, and I'm not really able to touch too much on that right now. I'll say that one of the things that we're thinking about, and this actually goes back to the combat part, is if you can get some weapons that have multiple uses that you would use under different circumstances. So I think a lot of the range stuff has to do with designing environments around different types of combat, scenarios, and having those environments be more than a corridor in a room where monsters are hanging out. That you can tell over there that part of the wall is weak, and your best ranged combat thing would be to destroy part of the wall to stop the enemies rather than fire arrows at them from a distance. So I think that makes for a more interesting experience.
There's something that happens with combat in a lot of role-playing video games. Once I started thinking about it, it's kind of struck me as odd ever since. Is that every enemy encounter is a fight to the death.
Right.
Which in most scenarios, when you think about it, is highly unrealistic.
Yeah.
Animals should attempt to flee if they can, and people might try to surrender to avoid being killed. Is this something you agree with, or is this something you're thinking about implementing?
Oh, for sure. No, and that's part of, like I said, the luxury of having more time in pre-production. So, instead of just putting together a list of going like, goblins rush at you and try to stab you, and a bear rushes at you and tries to bite you. And you can have a creature that is basically passive and won't attack you unless you corner it, or unless its children are nearby. I'm not just creating fodder for your sword. I'm creating a creature that lives here for a reason, has particular behaviors that make sense for its biological imperatives. Are there mindless zombie-like things that as soon as they see a living thing just go towards it and want to destroy it for no good reason? Absolutely. But the world is more interested in that, and it helps for keeping it keeps combat fresh. It makes the world feel more realistic to say, like you said, there's no reason to fight if you're not protecting your home, or you're hungry, or whatever. If it's just this guy has entered the room, maybe I'm going to just fly up to the perch and watch him.
Good. It's refreshing to hear that that's something you're considering. Throughout all this, you've really stressed the importance of factions and faction relationships and stuff like that. So clearly that's a central aspect of your design of the game.
Yeah.
And you describe it as being dynamic, and what that implies by itself is that player actions and player choices are going to affect how factions react to the player. Would that be accurate?
Oh, for sure. Yeah.
What I'm wondering about this is that does this, dynamic nature of factions, does this just apply to the player's relationship to factions, or does this also kind of work faction to faction as well, kind of behind the scenes?
Oh, for sure. Yeah, no, the faction to faction aspect is a big part of it. There's hardly ever a faction that is as it seems. We have kind of in addition to thiefy organizations, we've got one faction that is for lack of a better term, kind of a Robin Hoodie, merry men type of thing, where they are going around and they're robbing the rich and giving to the poor and needy. And so if you're saying, okay, well, I like being a thiefy outlaw type of character, but I'm not really a bad person, I'm gonna look into this. And once you start looking into it, I don't think I'm giving too much away to say that that's not their whole story. And there are people within the faction who believe in that kind of surface level thing of what they're doing. And there are people in the faction who, for example, are paid off by other noblemen to say, leave my caravans alone. I'll give you the secret location of this nobleman's caravan. You can still rob from them and give to the poor, and that's great, but it's going to hurt, the people that I'm in competition with. So a little more gray area into that. And within that faction, those different groups are at odds with each other, and your involvement with that faction can tilt the balance of which way the faction ends up going in general. So there's just a whole lot, that, like you said, I mentioned factions a lot because that's something that I think it really kind of drives a lot of the interesting story dynamics within the world.
One other thing I've wondered with these factions is, will these, sort of dynamic faction relationships, do these continue independent of the player? Say you want to go exploring for a little while and, you have nothing and absolutely nothing to do with the world's politics for that time. Could you come back and say, like a month's time in game and see that something has changed in your absence?
Yes. And what I would add on to that is a whole lot of effort is being put into making sure the player understands why. So it doesn't seem like random, I showed up over this place and all of a sudden it used to be an elvish town and now orcs are living there. And you go, well, why? I don't want you to play this world thinking random shit happens. That if the world changes, it's not hard to find out why. At least have a surface. I mean, there's probably more stuff for you to delve into and really get the sense of it. But in that simple thing, there was a war, and there's signs of there having been a war, and there's evidence of going back to like the Dragon Break. I don't want random stuff to happen, and you going like, I have no idea what to believe on that. So you can start saying, okay, well, this is the world makes sense, but we also try to communicate to you plainly what happened.
So it sounds like from what you're describing, we're talking about like actual changes to the state of the faction, it's standing in the world, etc.
Yeah.
So what might the effects of that look like? Could we end up seeing factions like die off or get absorbed as others get more powerful around them and try to seize more power and stuff like that?
Yeah, that's absolutely the plan, and a lot of it also has to do, getting even down to the microcosm of it, is the NPCs themselves. And I'm trying to think of how much I can say about this. Sorry.
So, I mean, for example, say you've got some powerful, warring nation that wants to seize territory and all that stuff. And you've got this, smaller sort of neighboring little kingdom that's, their target. Say there's a couple of possibilities that, maybe they just get annihilated and trampled by this more powerful nation, or maybe they'll become vassals of that, empire rather than be destroyed. Stuff like that. Is that kind of what you're talking?
Absolutely. And there's a certain part where, like I said, every little thing has ripples that go a lot beyond that. So in that case, maybe you weren't involved in a quest line that definitely defended the smaller kingdom, or got the secret plans for the castle to the larger kingdom so they could lay siege to them, or these things. And obviously there's some real direct stuff, but there's also a part where your actions might indirectly change that. I don't want to set up too many scenarios where it's David and Goliath at the very start, and David is almost instantly crushed. You gotta want to set up a little bit of like, well, this is the position. It's not going to, this faction isn't going to be instantly wiped out before you had a chance to get involved and hear about them. So there's a little balance that needs to be done with that. But yeah, all those different scenarios are that's the way it should work.
So the last area in terms of mechanics that I wanted to discuss with you is the question of accessibility and your target audience. Being a spiritual successor to Daggerfall says almost everything you need to know about what to expect of its systems and just the level of complexity involved here. I absolutely hate this terminology, but for lack of an alternative, are you aiming for a more hardcore audience? Is that what you're going for?
Yeah, but the funny thing was with Daggerfall, we didn't feel like we were aiming for a hardcore audience at the time we made it. We want the player to be doing fun stuff and not necessarily, the grudging, stuff that just because we include this mechanic on there. So you'd mentioned the quest markers, which are kind of a staple of a lot of role-playing games these days. And philosophically, I kind of feel a little ambivalent about them. I think it just depends on the implementation, because in Daggerfall, you're doing a quest where you need to go pick up a book over at the old bookseller. You run into an NPC in town and he says, here, let me mark that on your map. So I kind of feel like any time that you run into an NPC who says the equivalent of, let me put that on the map, or someone told you where something is and that thing is not going to be moving around. Like, if you're looking for a particular book and they're going like, I don't know, you could go check at this bookseller. Let me mark that on your map. Then a quest marker to tell you this is where the guy directed you towards. is absolutely fine. If it's something where the princess has been kidnapped, please find her, and the quest marker is wherever she's traveling across the land with this group of outlaws, then that's not something that you should have that magical ability to be able to track her down. So I think that there's a middle ground on that, but I think that under any circumstances we're not trying to be everything to everyone. So it's not this is not a casual gamer type of game. I think that's probably fair to say. But we also don't want to make it hard for the sake of being hard. I mean, and actually one of the other things that always comes up when I talk about Daggerfall is how many people started the opening dungeon and never finished it because it was too hard. That's not something that we want to recreate. I'd like people to get out into the world a little bit.
In what way are you approaching the question of difficulty? I know that a lot of RPGs will basically just have a slider that you move back and forth that when you boil it down, it really only affects things like enemy health and weapon damage and stuff like that.
Right.
Would you want to include something a little more granular than that so you could really, fine tune it to whatever's a good experience for that player?
Yeah. Oh no. I mean, that goes right with the kind of the virtual game master aspect of it, that, there's always the difficulty thing, there always needs to be challenge for the player, challenge and reward. But you should be able to recognize when the player has done the same thing 10 times and keeps failing at it, that there's an issue here, and the player is going to get bored or frustrated or whatever. So I think that having those things be adjustable, and even letting the player know some things are adjustable, after they keep on lock picking and not getting through, going like, we can do something with that. We'll keep the difficulty at the level. Are you having fun? And if not, we can work with you.
Let's move on to the setting. Let's talk a little bit about Archipelago. Obviously, it's a collection of islands, but what kind of variety can we expect? As we hop from island to island.
We began with our list of different types of environments and saying, what are there's the environment in terms of climate and type of trees and type of landscape. We put together a whole bunch of kind of inspirational images and whatnot to say, okay, we want to have these type of vistas. We want some cities with these influences, and some of them have to make sense for topographic. Some of them are cultural, and then even getting into kind of dungeons and those kind of old ruins and stuff like that, to say, well, this architecture evolved into this architecture, and you can see what the influences are on that. And then when I'm thinking of ruins, I'm all over the place. I'm sorry, but then I don't want to have made up languages that just like something's just like scrawled on there because it looks cool, that if you study it, then you'll come to realize, okay, well, that's what this means, and that's this letter combination means something different than something else. And so I guess, and I'm trying to think of, I want to talk about it without doing too many spoilers.
Gotcha, but we can expect a good amount of variety in terms of landscapes and climates and architectural styles and weather.
Because it's like I said, it's an archipelago. There's a whole lot having to do with you could do a lot of things with just kind of water and land together. That from different type of river systems to beaches to cliffs to the variety of things just with those couple of things that work is pretty fun to play with.
In this world, is Archipelago, is that all that is known about the world, or could there be like other lands beyond this world that we're going to know and experience?
Your sandbox ends at the archipelago, but they are aware of lands beyond that, and they are in maps, and they do have a history and relationships with these other land masses.
I do want to get to some of the different races and different cultures of the world, and you've revealed a few so far. By my count, you talked about humans, you've mentioned elves, dwarves, and at least at one point you've mentioned orcs being in this world. And then there's the Cambion. Is there any that I'm missing here that you've talked about so far?
Well, I don't know if I've revealed. I know what the other ones are, but I don't know if we've if we've reveal them. But it's a combination of kind of the classic races, and there's a couple brand new ones, and even on the classic ones, we always kind of like to do a twist. And it's certainly within a race. I mean, I think it's fine if orcs in general are stronger than people. I guess the strongest orc should be probably stronger than the strongest human, that they're just physiologically, and it's also it's really a different race. It's not that you have a different skin color or whatever. So there are things of different bonuses that you get for being different races, but we're trying not to be limited so that you can play your orc mystic or whatever.
When it comes to elves, obviously you're not talking about the little tree-dwelling Keebler elves or anything like that, but more towards what we're used to these days from Tolkien and the Elder Scrolls and so on. But my question is here, and obviously you don't have to get into specifics, but is there going to be anything that kind of sets these people apart from what we're used to seeing? You probably don't want to stray, too far from convention, but is there anything that makes these people unique that you can talk about?
Well, I'll say philosophically, I mean, again, the name of our game is the Wayward Realms. So what we begin with is, and this is kind of a design, I haven't really talked about this, but this has been kind of a overall design world building philosophy across all the decision making that we do. Is, I guess, a lot of it is flavored by familiar with a twist, because wayward, I don't know if I've really even talked about it. So the wayward is kind of an old fashioned term meaning weird, and like in Shakespeare's Macbeth, the witches that are seen at the beginning are described in the text as the wayward sisters. So there's a kind of an implication of magic, weirdness. So in all of those cases, when you're saying like, we don't want to stray too far from it, but we also don't want to just do what everyone else has done. Factions play a big role in all of these different races. So there's there's some broad stroke cultural things that could be said about orcs or elves or dwarves, but there's lots of exceptions to those rules, and there's lots of factions that battle within each other, with those kind of constraints implemented on them.
One thing I am particularly interested in is when it comes to dwarves, because if you're playing dwarves to type, then they're miners and they go deep into the earth and all that. So if I was that type of dwarf, the last place I would want to be is an island. I'm just imagining the poor dwarf that's, digs a little too far and breaks into the sea, flooding the entire mine. So I'm, and again, you don't have to get into specifics, but I'm assuming there's going to be some kind of twist on the dwarfs that, kind of rectify that sort of image going on. Yeah.
But again, it is that wayward thing. So I think that's fair to begin with that thing of like, when you think of dwarves, you think, like you said, mines. And then you say, well, if that's their history, what could that have evolved into? And if you've come from a place where that was more of the thing, and now you have some reason to be in the archipelago, what would that mean? So they have some real specialties, and all of the different races within the archipelago have their purview, their thing that they, either a territory that they rule over or have a lot of influence on, or a part of society, in some way, kind of like their place within the world. But there are some minds within the archipelago, so it's not like that's not going to be a thing at all. But they're involved in a lot of other things, and they've really come out to be a super influential group within the world. Maybe that's all I can say.
Oh, that's great. That's great. So earlier I did briefly mention the Cambion.
They're an interesting race in that they're not the only ones, but they are born into other races. So there's not like a Cambion family, or like not a Cambion biological family. So to a certain degree, they become found families, and different groups have different reactions to a Cambion being born into the family, and they range really wildly. So when there's a group of Cambion, they have found each other or chosen to be with each other. So the big thing about Cambion, and this is from real world myth, is that a Cambion is what is born of an incubus or a succubus and a human, and they're kind of half demons, and that is something that a lot of people believe in Wayward Realms. Whether or not that's the real truth and whatnot, you know my philosophy when it comes to obfuscating the truth. While knowing what the real thing is, they do tend to have what we would consider to be some stereotypically demonic features.
We do have a new piece of concept art that you're debuting now that I'd love to talk about. Does this sort of give us a glimpse into their culture? Because it's a very serene, very idyllic spot. They got a basket of fruit and wine, and everybody's very relaxed. And from what you've described, a Cambion can pop up just about anywhere. But this would hint that, at least some Cambion are more sophisticated and more peaceful than their demonic appearance would suggest. Is that kind of what you're going for?
Well, yeah, but I guess the only thing I'd say is that there's not one, even when Cambion seek themselves out, there's not sort of one faction that they would conglomerate into. So different ones have different reactions. And again, if you imagine that there are some groups who, when a Cambion is born into them, it's considered to be a demon child, and they're cast out, and that child will likely become bitter and may hate humanity or whatever society that they came out of, and really kind of become the demon that people always accuse them of being. So not all Cambion get-togethers are going to be this idyllic, to say the least.
I want to move on, and we can rapid fire these.
Yeah.
I want to talk about some creatures. The first one I want to point out is this Crabman. For me personally, I find this utterly terrifying, this thing. I just want to ask if there's anything else you want to add to this. Is this just some horrible nightmare monster you might run across, or anything else you want to add?
Well, the only thing that I would probably add, which it goes back to the Council of Wisdom, is that I don't know how this came about, but the people who joined our Discord, and I think like somebody got the ball rolling, and Crabmen became a thing, and everyone was demanding Crabmen, and fans would create Crabmen art, people would start doing Crabmen lore. I was very resistant because I felt bullied into accepting Crabmen, and then I evolved and said, I think that there might be something on this. I don't want to talk about it too much because like some people are like, I want to play a Crabman, and I'm not saying if that's in the cards or not. But we're responding to. I guess the overall thing is we are in the Council of Wisdom. Good ideas, even if we're not perceived as being a good idea at the beginning, can eventually find the life as a thing in the game.
Next, I wanted to look at this Specter. Are those its guts hanging down to the right? What's happening here? Is there anything you can add to this?
I've always been a big fan of undead in general in games, and it's fun to also, when you start thinking about cosmology and what death really means within the game, to do different variations on that.
So then I just want to spend a quick couple seconds on what I had first mistaken as a werewolf, but upon closer inspection, it's not. This appears to my eyes to be a wereboar. Is that correct?
That is absolutely correct.
Now, are we talking sort of a variety of, were creatures and stuff like that in the Wayward Realms?
Yeah, well, I mean, that was the thing. We will have werewolves in the game. I don't know if that's a spoiler or whatever, but if you're going to have lycanthropy, well, I have to stop calling it lycanthropy because it's Theracanpy. Like, I don't know how to say that out loud. I know how to write it, but it's that the transforming into a half beast. So we're exploring a whole lot of that, and we decided that if we're going to, everyone knows what a werewolf looks like. I mean, even if we do our own wayward twist on it, we actually had Wereboars in Daggerfall, so we decided that if we're going to release an image, we'll go ahead and do our own version of that. I don't know why I've always found boars to be really creepy, but that's where that came from.
Like you said, everybody kind of knows what a werewolf looks like, and you didn't invent the idea of a wereboar, but it is something that we don't see all that often.
Yeah.
So it is contrary to what people typically expect.
And the fun thing about that, I mean, obviously you immediately look at the tusks and the teeth and things like that, but if you look at the claws, that's a different type of thing because you've got the boar's cloven hoof. It becomes sort of a mix between a claw and a hoof on that, which I imagine would do a lot of damage.
So I assume that you're planning on this being a playable thing, like a player could become a were beast, as you say?
Yeah, I mean, the funny thing is, and we always talk about this when people talk about like, oh, are there going to be some special Easter eggs and stuff in the game? And the answer is yes. But we had vampirism and lycanthropy in Daggerfall, but it was never in the manual. It wasn't something we talked about beforehand. It's just something that happened. I think that there's a whole lot of stuff that can be done with these weird creatures that haven't been done in other games. I mean, everyone knows you get scratched by one and then after a certain amount of time, then you transform. But there's a whole lot of just in folklore, other aspects to them, which is going to be really fun to explore, and sort of also their place in society of different factions. Even though you think of them as just being these mindless, marauding things, different factions have different relationships with them.
Last but certainly not least, I want to talk about a new piece of concept art which hasn't been revealed up until now, and that's this Death Knight. I take it the figure in back is the knight in question, but what's he doing with this guy up front? What's going on here? The
Death Knight is one of our high-level undead creatures, and he is using his magic to increase his kingdom, and you have to fight through his minions before you fight him, which is going to be big in itself. I think it's a little bit like releasing the Wereboar instead of the werewolf, that we wanted to do some high-level undead but not go directly to the Lich. Just saying, okay, well, this guy does have his magic. It's more about command, as opposed to like the Lich being the undead wizard. So this is a undead king or knight in some way, but he still kind of retains that presence and the leader among the dead.
But then, at the same time, the overall look of his armor and stuff like that kind of implies that he's the undead king. He's going to control his minions, but at the same time, he could really pack a punch if he needs to.
Yep.
One of the pivotal groups that you've introduced is the Loremasters. Who are they, and what is the Library of Logos?
I think I can kind of do a little bit of a spoiler on this, that because you encounter them very early in the game. So there's not too much of a mystery. You wouldn't necessarily know this when you begin the game. So if you want to, stop listening if you want to do it completely fresh. But there's two factions at the very beginning of the game who are very antithetical, and one of them is trying to destroy these ancient relics in history and things having to do with the past, and another group is trying to protect them, and these are the Loremasters. So they have an area called the Library of Logos, and that's where they've been hiding away all of the things that for centuries they've been trying to collect.
Do the Loremasters have like an overall mission or an objective that they're working towards, or are they primarily the protectors of ancient knowledge within the library?
Well, and again, like any other faction, there's sub-factions within them, so they have different philosophies about what they're trying to do. So their overall thing is protection and of lore, of and everything that falls into that category. So books and artifacts and whatnot, because this other faction has made it their mission to destroy this stuff. So that's their overall goal.
You've shown that the Loremasters are a pretty diverse group.
Yeah.
There appear to be representatives of different races, and you mentioned sub-factions, but are there sort of different factions within the Loremasters as well?
Yeah, I mean, we have to imagine, again, this is a group that's been around for hundreds of years, and you've joined up with the Loremasters because you believe that there's history and valuable things, powerful items that is being destroyed, and it has to be protected. Your way of doing that sort of how violently you respond to it. There are also people who have stronger affinities toward this is the only item that I really care about, and you can have a sub-faction that's dedicated to protecting that sole item, and they don't go really give a shit about anything else that's in there. There's the library where they've stored all these things is a massive dungeon, and it's a really complex place because, again, if you can imagine a world that has been dug out for hundreds of years, and the things that are stored there even can influence the dungeon itself. So it's a very twisted location, and a lot of rules get broken in that area. So the Loremasters could almost be described as just a city or a town, and the people of that town who don't want the town to be destroyed, but they've got a lot of different personalities all within that.
So along those lines, you mentioned sub-factions within the Loremasters, different philosophies, different approaches, different priorities, things like that. Does that mean that there's a potential for infighting among the Loremasters?
I think it's more a guarantee than a potential.
Okay. Getting back to the library. The Library of Logos is more than just a collection of books, as you've said.
Yeah.
You've mentioned artifacts and creatures within and stuff like that. You've shown that it's absolutely enormous, and you just said how big this place is. One thing I do want to take just a quick second to look at is this gigantic scroll that you've shown. You've mentioned that the text of this scroll is decipherable, correct? This does say something?
Yeah.
Are you aware of anyone who's made any progress on that? On breaking down the cipher and figuring out what it says?
I'm not aware of it being successfully deciphered. I mean, what's always interesting is I guess it's what's that term where you can find patterns and randomness or whatever. There are some translations that kind of make sense, but it's not what it's in this. So yeah, it's not yet been solved, but I did write some stuff and we translated, but it's not. Maybe the best clue is that in this and in various other kind of runic languages, and this is maybe more of a practical consideration than anything else, is that you don't want something that is letter to letter translatable into English, because there's going to be a localization of the game eventually, and you don't want it to be, okay, well, you bought the French version and now you're okay, this translates into this English phrase, and now you have to translate the translation.
No, that's an excellent point.
And it just doesn't make any sense for it to say. I mean, I'm fine with the kind of the concept of there's a common tongue, and in your version of the game it's going to be in English, and someone else's version it's going to be in Russian, and that's just, you have to have a little leap of logic to say we need to convey stuff to you, so we're just going to do it in a modern language. I guess that's the best kind of clue, is to say, don't necessarily think this symbol always means this letter. And it's also not the only runic language that we have in the game.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I assume there will be more than just the one, because I mean, you've got multiple races and cultures and environments, right, and stuff like that, and that would just be a natural byproduct of that scenario. We have a final piece of concept art to debut and show off, and unless I'm mistaken, this scene is happening inside the Library of Logos. Am I right?
That's correct.
So, of course, the first question is what?
What is happening?
Yeah, well, I mean, more so, what is this horrific thing that it looks like the love child of a beholder in the Sarlacc?
I think that's the language that I used on that as well.
All right. So what is this thing and what's going on here?
Well, it goes back to what we were talking about with creatures in general, is that you start off with something that is, it does need to have a gameplay purpose for inventing in the world, but then we spend a good amount of time figuring out what its actual motivation is and what it is that it's trying to do. And this is a creature that tends to be called the Bookworm, and that it is a scourge of the library because that's what it wants to eat. It's not going, if you get into a fight with it, it's not trying to eat you, but if you're standing between it and its meal, then you might get hurt. And that's what these guys are kind of discovering on that. So the Logos is even without regard of the other faction that I mentioned, it does have a couple natural predators that cause it some heartache.
Another thing which you just alluded to that you've talked about previously is the Inquisition. I understand that they're the antagonists of the Loremasters, and they want to wipe out any trace of magic, from the world. What more can you tell us about the Inquisition?
Part of the thing that's really is fun about the process of going through and creating this concept art is you kind of feed the concept artists a certain amount, but not too much, and let them kind of interpret things as they will. The Inquisition kind of has two symbols, one which is sort of accidental and one which was part of from the design. So they've got a unique weapon that tends to be what they use to show that they've been there. So like if you come to a place and the bookstore has been burned to the ground, and you'll see this symbol scrawled over there to let you know you better not take these people's places, because this is what's gonna we're the ones who were involved in this. But the funny thing is that their deity that they follow is a pretty benevolent one, and that sort of came about accidentally, where the symbol for this deity was put into the Inquisition's uniforms. And initially I said, no, that's the wrong deity to be in there. And then again, a little bit like the Crabmen, I said, actually, I kind of like it, because the Inquisition thinks what they're doing is good. Like everybody, I don't like we're out to do evil. And if you think of someone who's out to stop magic and burn books and stuff like that, you're like, you sound like you're not just the antagonist of the Loremaster, but the antagonist of the whole world. And no, you think that what you're doing is the right thing, and you're saving people by doing this. So then I said, no. Well, that's a secondary symbol for them. So that's kind of the fun part about sort of brainstorming some of these concept art, is when things appear that you weren't expecting and improve things.
Yeah, no, that's great, because it's like you were talking about. When you talk about concepts like good and evil, it's hard to find a credible, believable example of someone or some entity that is doing evil for evil's sake. There has to be some kind of logical motivation there. Everybody's the hero of their own story, and so everybody thinks that what they're doing is right. Yep. Unless you're a gibbering, madman, and then that's something else. It's great that the Inquisition, might have that kind of backstory established, that they believe that what they're doing is right. It might not be in the grand scheme of things, but if they believe in their cause, it makes them a more intimidating kind of force, if this is something that they believe is right, and therefore it's something that they're going to put their all into. So that's the great thing to see and a great thing to hear. One of the last things I'd like to ask about concerns the main story of Wayward Realms, and main stories in general, I suppose. It's a problem that seems to occur in just about every open world game that I can think of. It's that at the beginning of the game, the main story is established as something that's important, at least. Even if it's not literally the fate of the world on the line, it still has impact, and there's still something crucial at stake going on, at the very least from a character perspective. It has to be that way, because without stakes there's no conflict, and without conflict there's no story. Where this creates a problem, at least for me in an open world game, is that if the player has the option of putting the main story aside for potentially hundreds of hours, and then they can come back to it and see that the situation hasn't really changed, doesn't that just dissolve all stakes? From a story perspective, why should a character's actions matter if there are no consequences for inaction?
For sure.
Is that something that you've thought about addressing, or?
Oh yeah, no. And that's something that again, going back to Daggerfall, we played around with that a lot, because it was the stuff that you're being told to do at the beginning in Daggerfall has seems like it's kind of high stakesy stuff. Well, I guess you're given two quests in the beginning of Daggerfall. One is King Lysandus is haunting his former kingdom, and you need to deal with that. that's very peripheral to actually the main plot of Daggerfall. The secondary one, where I sent a letter to the Queen and it never arrived, is he and this was direction given to the actor who delivered the lines of like, just like toss this one off, like, oh, and if you can try to find out what's if it's a letter, it's kind of it's a sentimental letter, and I'd rather not have it not be out there, and that leads to the whole quest of Numidium. So that's a little bit to suggest that when you get to the part where you see how big the stakes are, you're already kind of invested into the world itself. We had to create a main story where there's a big consequence, activating this giant stompy robot that's going to destroy everything. But in that case, everyone's going to freeze and not do anything until you make the decision of who to give the totem to and who kind of comes out on top of that. So we recognize on that we could if we give the player choices, if we have the world change according to the player's decisions, that we also had to kind of freeze the world before the player makes this choice. Without giving stuff away for the main story for Wayward Realms, I guess I could say that this has been a big obsession of mine for decades. I passionately believe in giving the player choices and having those choices have consequences, and having those consequences be potentially major. As a writer, I like structure. I like something that might have a little bit of a build up and stuff. And by the way, this goes even to main quests, that when we're structuring those, we don't think of that quest is only activated when you go to talk to a quest giver. That if we're doing the werewolf one, you've gone into this town and there's signs of a werewolf attack, and you know that there's a problem before you go to the quest giver and say, is there anything I can help you with? So I think that sometimes is a left out part on a lot of these quests, is like, we get to the big stakes or the big thing you got to do before we give kind of an act one. Here's the situation in this world and why you should care about this quest. So extrapolating that, I know there's a long-winded answer, and unfortunately I'm not going to 100% be able to even answer it at the end of this, is structure is really important. Player choices are really important. I think we've figured out a way to match those them together, but it does mean that there's going to be a lot of difference between your story and my story, I guess is maybe the most non-spoiler way of me saying that they should both be epic and consequential. But again, if you're playing from the point of view of a thief involved in underground activities, and I'm playing as a mage, we're really approaching the situation in very different ways, and that's the big consideration on that.
It's refreshing to hear you say things like that, because you're saying that it's not going to be a situation where you wake up and all of a sudden something happens that indicates, the end of the world is nigh and only you can stop it. But you can go over there and pick some mushrooms for a little while, where
right.
you have that disconnect. And I'm glad to hear you talk about it the way that you are, because it sounds like you're taking things like that into consideration, and it's definitely a primary consideration. It's something that isn't often seen, so that is refreshing to hear. Finally, before we wrap this up, I do want to ask for the people watching if they're interested in learning a little more about Wayward Realms, or if they think they'd like to help out with the project, what can they do?
Well, obviously we've got our standard social media. You can follow if you want to, just kind of keep updates. Our Discord channel has been sort of the primary area where we've got within the channel, we've got a bunch of rooms where different aspects of the world can be discussed, and I try to be as active on that as possible. If one thing that, because we do have a good number of concept artists, and we've created a bunch of that. We've got some writers. We can always use coders who have some Unreal experience. Would be amazing to get on. Animators, we've got some people, actually 3D artists in general, who can take some of this concept art and help us make it into something we can actually put in the game. All of this would be helpful. But really, if you're interested in, or over 18, then we would love to talk to you about being involved, because like I said, some of the best ideas have just come out of the community. So we want to continue that. Send what you're thinking, send a resume or and it'll eventually get passed to the team, and we'll try to find some work for you.
Ted, thank you so much again for joining me and for taking part in this discussion. I know it ran a little long, and for answering my questions. It's as I said before, it's really an incredible gesture, and I really appreciate you taking the time to do this with me. I will definitely be keeping my eye on the Wayward Realms, and I'm looking forward to watching the project grow. I wish you and I wish OnceLost Games all the good fortune you can really get. As a final note, I also do just want to thank you for all the work that you did on the Elder Scrolls series, especially your contributions to the lore. As it turned out, some of the very first books that I bothered to stop and read in game were written by you. By the time I finished, 2920, I was pretty well hooked by then. I can say without hesitation that were it not for the work, the care, and the heart that you put into those stories, I would not have started making these videos, and you and I would not be talking to each other right now.
I appreciate that.
So to anybody watching who's made it this far, first of all, congratulations. I have no idea how long this will end up being, but I know it won't be short. But also, if you're a subscriber and if you enjoy my examinations of the Elder Scrolls lore, then please leave a comment below expressing your gratitude to Ted Peterson, as well as to all of the other writers and artists out there who put their souls into the works that they create. That's something that's truly magical, and it enriches us all, and they deserve every bit of appreciation that they can get. So, Ted, thank you again from all of us.
That's very kind. Thank you.
Do you have any closing thoughts whatsoever?
No, I think let's do something like this again.
Okay, yeah, I would be excited to, as the project grows, and see if there's anything else you wanna talk about. So I guess that's it. I guess we'll wrap this up. Thank you very much for watching, everybody. This has been Double Negative with Ted Peterson. Take care and have a wonderful day.